Okay, so tonight, this is DelVal Turner's regular meeting for June. We have Scott Wishart with us. Scott's going to present wood turning and resin. So we've got a combination of materials. Scott's been very prominent on Instagram and now YouTube. We're really pleased to have him here tonight, and I'll let him introduce what he's going to cover tonight, and we're very pleased to have you here. Thanks for coming out for us.
Yeah, well, thanks for the intro, and thanks for having me. I mean, I'm kind of almost honored that you even asked me to do this. I did something similar for my club, but I mean, in club things, this is kind of like my first presentation that I've done for another club. So thank you very much. That's kind of awesome that you asked. So like Scott said, my name's Scott Wishart, and I'm from Media, PA. Didn't always used to be from Media, PA. So I used to live in New Jersey for the longest time. Actually, that's where I was born, raised, grew up in New Jersey, and then moved here not too long ago. Everybody kind of does like a little bit of intro and background and everything. So I guess maybe I should do that, right? So I'm actually going to switch over to my PowerPoint real quick. Okay, so the intro, right? So I already told you who I was and everything, so we'll go off. And where did I start woodworking? I started off doing flat work, right? I think a lot of people do that. I don't know anybody who's actually come up and told me, and maybe one of you have, but like, hey, I started wood turning and I never did anything else before. So, I started out with just regular tools. A lot of it was just based on, I needed stuff around the house and it was too expensive to have somebody do it. So I learned how to make things, I'm sure we all can relate with that. And this is one of the projects that I made that my wife wouldn't let me sell. So this actually still hangs on the wall in our house now here in Media. And I'm kind of cheating with this picture because I actually turned all those, the o'clock markers, all the buttons that made out of ebony. I turned all those on my old jet lathe that I have actually donated at this point since I don't need it anymore. So, but that's where I started. I started doing like cabinet work and, making stuff for the house and all that kind of stuff. And then I kind of got really interested in doing some other things. And this is a little bit more complex, still a flat work project, right? But I mean, this is probably the most involved bottle opener I think I've ever made in my life, right? So, I mean, it's made out of walnut. It has book matched back, which you can see on there. If you look at the top, it's book matched top, and that's made out of some spruce, and it's got an ebony fingerboard, and it's got a other ebony appointments. And I kind of modeled it after a Taylor guitar that I owned, and I actually wound up giving this to my guitar teacher. So it was a lot of work as a gift, but this is the kind of stuff that I used to do, right? So made some bandsaw boxes. I mean, that's kind of like, that was my thing, like the flat woodwork. I went out and bought a bandsaw. I guess if you have a bandsaw, you make a bandsaw box, but you can see like it's everything but wood turning, right? I got asked, my daughter was friends with a couple, they were getting married, and she asked me to make them something that she could give them for their wedding. And now this chest is probably about like maybe 2.5 foot across and maybe about like, a little bit over a foot deep, and a little over a foot tall. So it's not small, but it's not huge, and it's made out of sapele and some zebra wood. And then I fashioned this little thing for the front. So, and you can't really see it. You almost can. There's like a little line right above where it says gifts. There's actually a piece of wood there that's sloped down into the box. So when the guests came to the wedding, they could drop their cards in there, right? So like I said, this is the kind of work I did. And then I had another friend of mine, he asked me to make him a golf club. And I was like, who makes golf clubs, right? Okay, I'll give it a shot. And this doesn't have any finish on it yet, but I mean, this is zebra wood, purple heart, and ebony. And the funny thing about this is it didn't weigh enough actually to be a golf club. So I actually drilled some holes in it and I filled it up with musket balls. So, just threw some lead in there just to give it that extra weight. And I had a putter from when I used to play golf, and I kind of just kept weighing it until it weighed about as much as my putter did. So, and you know, my friend Henry, he owns this now, and he won't use it because he says it's too nice to take out on the golf course. So, you know, I guess that's good. I guess, I don't know, you know. So, but that's what I was doing. You know, I was doing flat work, and it was a lot of fun, and I was having a good time with it. And I just don't remember exactly what project that I was, you know, researching or whatever, but I guess like everybody else, you need to do something, you go to YouTube and you find out what to do, right? And it's like, you see like, oh, I need to do this, I need to do that. And I got all the information I needed for whatever that project was, and I just stopped paying attention to the YouTube feed. And you know, I mean, they'll just keep playing video after video. And the next thing you know, I'm watching some turning videos, and it's just like, I'm just totally fascinated, like totally fascinated. And that's just like, I'm just glued to the TV now, watching YouTube videos over and over and over again. And then, you know, I have to give props to Carl Jacobson because he is in that feed. And then there's another one of his videos, and now I'm just watching everything on his channel, right? And it's just like, I mean, I just couldn't get enough of wood turning. And then Mike Walt, and I guess we all watch those guys and everything. And then it's just everybody else that, you know, has something up on YouTube that has like kind of like, you know, a decent amount of followers, a decent feed, and just like, how do you not watch that stuff, right? I mean, I was like a trout, right? I mean, they put the hook in my mouth and I got landed, right? So I guess like the next month after that first video, I went out and bought this jet lathe, right? Which I no longer own. Actually, I donated it to someone in my club. So, but I bought this lathe, and then, you know, since I did flat work, I built the cabinet for it, and, you know, little there's a door now that covers that where the grinder is, you know, and that's on like a little drawer type slider rail, so the grinder pulls out. And the side, you can see there's like a little bit of a plywood thing on the side, and that actually goes. I didn't have a lot of space in my shop, right? So that whole thing would come out of its little pocket, and then that table would pop up on the side, so I could actually put the grinder up on the side, and so I could sharpen my tools while I was turning. And then I had to put everything away because I put my car in the garage, and it was just a one-car garage. So everything came out, everything went back, everything was on wheels, right? So, so here was the kind of like a shot of my workshop, and this was the, you know, Scott's Mini Wood Shop at its inception. So, mostly flat wood work. I had a little lathe tucked in, you know, and I did little projects, you know, and I think that we all kind of do that, right? And some of those little projects were just like, you know, some pepper grinders, some small bowls. You know, I couldn't turn much anything bigger than, you know, 10 inches anyway. I mean, that 1221, I mean, unless you're going to move the banjo completely out of the way, you still can't even turn anything 12 inches, right? So, I mean, that was pens and a lot of more pens, and then some bottle openers, and then a lot more pens, and a couple Christmas ornaments, and a bunch of more pens, and you get the idea, right? So that's kind of like how I started with all the wood turning stuff. So, you know, as life would have it, you know, I was out riding my bike with my wife, and luckily she did not have the same problem I did, but I wound up running into a big giant pile of brush that was in the shoulder that was left there by one of those companies that clears the tree branches away from the wires, right? So, I mean, it was probably about like 3 foot tall, about like 4 foot wide. She just happened to be riding out further away from the curb line than I was. And this is the 8 screws in the metal plate that put my collarbone back together, right? So my wood turning kind of like went by the wayside for a while, right? I mean, so did everything else. I was actually, because of the way this healed and everything, I was out of commission for the better part of like 6 months, you know? And unfortunately, at the same time, both of my parents had passed away. I was in the orthopedic surgeon's office discussing how they were going to put my collarbone back together again when my sister called me to tell me that my dad died. And then my mom passed away, you know, about 4 months later. So that whole year kind of sucked, you know. But then, you know, life goes on, right? And then now I live in Media, PA, and I'm loving it out here. And so That whole move also took forever because of, my broken collarbone, couldn't move anything, couldn't fix up anything in the house, had to wait. There was construction that was going on at the house that we moved into. So just like a comedy of errors. And I was kind of like out of woodworking or wood turning for the better part of like a year and a half. And so then after we got all moved into the house and media and everything got, we settled in, I went out and I bought myself a new lathe, and then I started turning bowls. We turned, decent sized bowls now because I had a decent sized lathe. I mean, as you can see in the one picture, I have a robust American Beauty. So it's like, it's a beautiful piece of equipment, very fortunate to have that. And to be honest, that is the last gift my parents gave me, because they did leave me, I got a little bit of money from them when they passed away, and, not a ton, but it was enough to buy that lathe. And that was their gift to me. And I'm going to cry if I keep talking about that. So let's not go there. Right. So but anyway, I got this nice lathe and I started turning a bunch of bowls, so I mean, what else do you turn on a lathe when you got a big giant lathe, right? You turn a bunch of bowls and then you turn more bowls. And, these are a couple of rough outs that I did, and then, you start pushing the envelope a little bit, and here's the big bowl. I mean, this thing's probably like the better part of like, 18 to 20 inches across. I mean, you probably give a kid a bath in there. It's so big, right? So I don't know what you do with it. I gave it to my sister-in-law, and she actually uses it for salads when she has a lot of company. So, I mean, at least it's getting used, but I mean, that's all well and good, but then you start wanting to do a few other things, right? So, I mean, it kind of branched out a little bit, and this is a weird bowl, right? I mean, a little bit of an experiment for me, but this is a bowl emerging from another bowl. This is all one solid piece of wood, right? So, I mean, that was a fun project. It was like my first attempt at doing anything off axis. I think it came out pretty good. So, and then from there, right? I mean, where do you go from there? So I jumped into holoforms. I was fortunate enough to meet John Jordan. I was his ride when he was here for the Mid-Atlantic Wood Turning Symposium a few years ago. And I got an email from the people running the symposium, and they said, hey, can you pick up somebody at the airport, and take them out to Lancaster? And I'm thinking like, oh, okay, I got nothing else better to do. It just so happened to be John Jordan. So it's like, and we've been friendly ever since. And John's a great guy. So I don't know if you've ever met him or not, but he's a hell of a guy. So, but it kind of really sparked my interest talking to him about the holoform thing. So I really kind of got into that, and I still like to make a lot of holoforms and everything, so. And then of course there's, crazy projects when you have friends who ask you to make them crazy things. Like, this is my friend Roger, and Roger's a firefighter, and he lost his leg because of some infection that he got. It had nothing to do with him firefighting. It's just some crazy, weird thing. But he lost his leg. And so I'm sitting with him, having a couple drinks, and Roger says to me, he goes, hey, so you're doing this wood turning thing, right? And I go, yeah. And he goes, can you make me a wooden leg? I want to be a pirate for Halloween. And I said, are you kidding me? And it's like, he was not kidding, obviously not kidding. So, but yeah, so that's wood turning, right? So how do you go from doing all that and then getting into resins? It's like, kind of a crazy thing, but I think it's just, for me, it was like almost like a natural progression, right? I mean, it was just like the next step, it's just like, hey, well, I had a couple bowls that had some knots in them that cracked. And it's just like, well, how do you fill the crack? And then you see some pieces that people did where they have inlay with some like crushed stone. And it's just like, well, I wonder if I could do that with some type of, like epoxy or some type of resin or something other than crushed stone. And so you start snowballing ideas. And of course, then at some point you have to try it, right? So, and that's going to bring us to, wood turning and resins, right? So I've done quite a few pieces of now with resins, and like everything from pens to holoforms. And I make these spheres, Star Wars themed spheres that seem to be really popular. I mean, it helps fund my shop, so I'm really happy about that. So, and we'll get more into that at the end. So, but anyway, so if you want to get started doing work with resin, the most important thing really is safety, right? I mean, that should be all our concern. So, we want to make sure that you wear gloves. And you're going to see in the videos that sometimes I'm not, right? Now you can see some resins will tell you that, there's no volatile chemicals, they're perfectly safe. Not every resin says that. So you got to be really careful about, what you're using. It's probably just best to wear gloves all the time, right? You see the next bullet point down there is to avoid fumes. Once again, it really kind of varies resin to resin. But I mean, I can tell you a story about, I used the original Total Boat resin and I tried to pour that into a 4-inch cube mold. And so many fumes were coming out of that I actually had to leave the shop and I couldn't go back in for 2 days, right? So you really got to be careful, pay attention to like the warnings from the manufacturer, right? Make sure that your area is well ventilated, okay? And when you're turning the resin, obviously, face shield, you want to wear a dust mask. You don't want to be breathing in all that resin dust. Obviously not good for you, right? I mean, we protect ourselves from the wood dust. I think you definitely want to protect yourself from all that plastic dust, right? So let's
Hey,
go into what
Scott, can I
I'm
just
sorry.
can I just say, if folks have questions,
Yes.
please use the chat. And we are encouraging questions. I guess, Scott, if you want to let people ask directly, that's up to you. But I think the chat would probably be best.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. And you know what, Scott, and if you can keep an eye on that and just let me know if someone types in a question. And
Yeah.
really, if anybody's got any question about anything, just stop me, right? I mean, I'll just prattle on forever if you let me. So, okay, so what is resin, right? So, and this is just a definition, right? So, I mean, resin, it's a solid or highly viscous substance, that's either of plant or synthetic origin that typically is convertible into polymers. And it's just like, oh yeah, that's great. Who cares, right? I mean, so, I mean, what is it really? I mean, for the most part, resin is going to be the stuff that makes your wood finishes hard, like stuff like shellac is actually a natural resin where, the alkyds that you find in a lot of your varnishes or polyurethane, obviously not natural. And then, but we're really here to kind of focus more on 2-part resins, right? Resins used for wood turning, casting, stabilizing, I mean, that sort of thing. And that's kind of like what this focus is going to be more on than anything else. Okay? So we got any questions so far? Here, let me go back to me. Any questions so far? Anybody? Just wave. Let me know you're still watching.
That's it. Scott,
right.
when you're worried about fumes, as you're using the resins, you really can't tell that they're there until it's like too late, right? I mean, is there a way to? Are you just running fans like right from the get-go, or exhausting? What are you doing to protect this shop area?
Okay, so for me, what I do is I generally tend to use resins that are safe to use and not really have a lot of fumes.
Okay.
And the reason why I mentioned it is because unless you look into it, you're not going to know that, right?
Right.
Like my mistake with Total Boat. I mean, everybody said, hey, use Total Boat epoxy, blah, 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 right? So I went out and I bought some. And, not knowing any better, I poured a big mass, like, 4-inch cube mold full of resin, and it was a disaster. I mean, I really could not come back in here for days. It just stunk to high heaven. I just left, and then, days with the shop door open, I have, some cross ventilation because of windows, but I didn't want to be in here. So I mean, I guess that was my wake-up call to make sure that like the stuff that I buy is stuff that's like, not a lot of fumes. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about polyester resin, which I've never used, but everybody who's used it, and it says it right on the the documentation on the labeling. I mean, you really got to protect yourself from fumes, blah blah blah. It's chemicals, right? It's a chemical reaction that you're doing. It's like a lot of them are what's it, exothermic, so it creates heat, and how much heat depends on the mass of the resin. So
Okay.
All right. So we're really here. We're going to be talking about 2-part resins. Okay. And so your typical 2-part resins that you're going to be dealing with for casting and that type of stuff. And let's see, did I miss a slide? No. Okay. Are going to be like either polyester resin, urethane resin, epoxies, which is kind of like more like a family. Now, obviously, there's epoxy glue, there's tabletop epoxies, there's deep pour epoxies, there's casting epoxies, and they're all different, right? You just can't really say like, hey, what resin do you use? I mean, it's like, what resin do you use for a specific purpose would be, to me, a valid question. Kind of like we spoke about a little bit earlier about like, what golf club would you use? Well, I mean, it really depends on how far you are away from the hole, right? Or are you in the sand, or are you in the rough, or whatever? I mean, it's like everything's going to change depending on circumstances. And that's kind of like a good comparison, at least for me, So, but all these resins, I mean, they're all kind of just, they're two-part chemical where you mix part A with part B, and then that creates the resin that you're going to use for, either casting or whatever. So for wood turners, what are we going to use for resin? And generally speaking, we're either going to be using casting resins or we're going to be using stabilizing resins, right? So we're going to talk about stabilizing resins first, and I have them broken down into two different things that I actually have used before. There might be more. I'm not the be all to end all. I can only talk about the stuff that I've actually used myself, right? But one of those stabilizing resins is epoxy, right? It's penetrating epoxy. And I've had some good luck with that in certain circumstances. And it really is just like a very thin epoxy that you can paint on to your project just to, stiffen up the wood fibers. I'm sure you've all heard of the cactus juice before. I mean, that would be the typical resin that people would use for vacuum stabilization, right? Where you put something in a vacuum chamber. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. I mean, I know you have, Scott, you told me you got somebody doing a presentation on that for you soon, right?
We don't have it scheduled yet, Scott, but feel free to just touch on it. But
okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about it. It's not going to be super in depth, but it'll give you the basics, but I don't want to take away anything from another presenter. So I kind of, like I said, I'm just going to touch on it. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds great. Sure.
And then apart from the stabilizing resins, I mean, your casting resins, I mean, they're broken down into those three categories that we talked about. So, either urethane resins, which, I have a picture on the screen of Alumilite's Amazing Clear Cast Plus, right? Now, everybody thinks Alumilite is one product, and Alumilite is the name of a company, right, that makes many different types of resins. It just so happens that one of the resins that they make is actually called Alumilite, which is confusing to people. So, but I'll talk more about that as well. So, but let's talk about stabilizing resins real quick, right? So, I mentioned penetrating epoxy, and here's two different brands that I've used, okay? Total Boat makes a really nice penetrating epoxy, but it's, once again, it's a part A, part B. You mix them up, it's extremely thin. It penetrates the wood really well. And what would that be good for? I mean, to me, that's good for if I'm turning like a piece of spalted wood and it's decent, but there's areas that are punky, right? Well, you can paint this penetrating resin on there and you let it sit for a couple days, it'll soak into the wood, it'll harden, and then you won't have to deal with that punkiness anymore. And I paint the entire thing, right? And so, I mean, that way it doesn't look like, hey, well, this part looks like you painted some type of something on it and this part doesn't. And then you have an uneven finish when you put your finish on it. And to be honest, I mean, if you paint the entire thing with penetrating epoxy, you probably could just get away with buffing it and not have to put a finish on it at all. I guess technically you would have a finish on it because you really kind of coated the entire thing with epoxy, right? So now the thing with these penetrating epoxies, right, the wood has to be dry. And dryness with epoxies is kind of a relative term, okay? So you'll see that some stuff, when it says dry, it means like almost air dry. As long as there's not like a lot of moisture. And you'll see when we talk about, cactus juice, dry for cactus juice is 5% moisture or less, right? And that's kind of a hard thing without putting something in an oven, right? So, but anyway, getting back to this, the wood must be dry. the epoxy will not displace moisture in the wood. So if the wood's damp, the epoxy's not going to get in there to penetrate. You know, it won't harden, it won't stiffen up the fibers. Obviously, you're working against yourself, right? So just make sure if you're going to use that, the wood's got to be dry, right? And it's extremely easy to use. You just got to follow the directions, you know, and everybody has a mix ratio for their epoxy or their resin or whatever. And it's just like, okay, you're going to take so much of part A and mix it with so much of part B, mix it thoroughly. Excuse me. And that mixing thoroughly is extremely important. And with this penetrating epoxy, it's the consistency of water. And you literally can just take a foam brush and paint it on the wood. Okay. And so that, I mean, it's great for certain things. Okay. And then we have the stabilizing resins like cactus juice, right? Now, cactus juice, and there are other things out there that do the same thing, right? They're basically used for vacuum stabilization. Okay. And the way that they kind of work is you put them in a vacuum chamber. And I'll talk more about this, but just the overview. You put them in a vacuum chamber, right? You put your pieces of wood in there. You suck all the air out of the wood. I'm sorry. I thought I heard somebody's. Did someone have a question? No? All right, cool. So you suck all the air out of the wood. And then when you release the vacuum, you know, after a certain amount of time, that negative pressure inside the wood sucks the resin into the wood. Okay. But once again, if there's any moisture in the wood, that won't work. So you got to make sure all the moisture's gone, right? Now, I have a couple friends who have basically painted this cactus juice once it's been activated. And once again, this is a two-part, right? You have the big giant jug that everybody sees, but it comes with a little tiny bottle of activator that you have to put in there to make it work, right? So once this stuff's activated, I've had some friends paint that stuff on and just let it soak into the wood. And to cure this resin, it needs a heat source. You know, a lot of the other resins, as a matter of fact, almost all the other resins that I'm going to talk about, other than this one, it creates their own heat, right? I mean, just the chemical reaction creates its own heat, which then cures the resin. This one requires that you put it in an oven. Okay, and you can see the last bullet point on here. It requires the heat source to cure, and you need to put it in an oven somewhere between 190 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, or it won't cure at all. Okay, and that's the recommendation from the manufacturer. So, but like I said, I have some friends that have tried, you know, once again, punky wood. They didn't want to buy any of the penetrating epoxy, but they did have cactus juice on hand. And it works similar, you know, different results based on different types of wood, you know, how punky the stuff is. But, you know, if you have the stuff around, it's not going to hurt to try it, right? Thinking outside the box just a little bit, right? So now we're just going to kind of focus on this whole vacuum stabilization thing and what is it, how it works, you know, what do you do with it, what the equipment that you're going to need, right? And here's the basics, right? Basic equipment you're going to need, obviously you're going to need wood, right? You're going to need some type of stabilizing resin. You're going to need an oven, okay? And then you're going to need a vacuum chamber, a vacuum pump, and you're going to need that oven again a second time. And the reason I'm saying that is the first time you need the oven, you got to cook all the moisture out of the wood. And the second time you need it to cure the resin, okay? All right, so just an overview of how this all works. You're going to cut your pieces of wood the size because you really don't want to stabilize wood that you don't want to stabilize, right? I mean, it's like you're just throwing material away and there's no need for that. So cut the pieces the size. You can see here, even in the oven, in the picture I have on here, I have a spalted maple box that's in the oven, and it's rough turned, and it's in the oven to dry. And that's going to be stabilized. But I wouldn't want to stabilize the entire big piece because I would just turn all that inside part away, right? So it's just best you know, to start out with like a rough turn piece or cut things into blocks the size you know you're going to use, you know, either be pen blanks or, you know, pieces that you're going to use for bottle stoppers. Or for me, I mean, all my Star Wars spheres, I use, you know, like either a 4-inch square or a 5-inch square piece of burl, and they're all cut to size before I stabilize anything, right? So you're going to cut your wood to size. You're going to want to dry that wood in the oven at 220 degrees Fahrenheit, right? That's above water's boiling temperature. So that way you make sure that all the water in the wood gets boiled off, okay? According to the manufacturer of cactus juice, they say the moisture content for your wood should be less than 5%, and they recommend it be closer to 0, okay? The closer it is to 0, the better it will be, and the more the cactus juice will get absorbed into the wood, the less time it'll spend in the vacuum chamber. So it's like a win for everybody, right? So after you're done cooking the wood in the oven, you want to let it cool down. You don't want to put that hot wood into the cactus juice, or it'll just cure right on the surface, and you don't want that. You got to let it cool down to room temperature. And what the manufacturer suggests that you do, and this is something that I've never done, is to take the wood out of the oven and put it immediately into a airtight Ziploc bag. I'm not going to do that, but if you want to, great. I just let it cool down in my shop, and once it's cool to the touch, you know, so it's about room temperature, I put it in the vacuum chamber, okay? So here's a picture of my vacuum chamber. Mine's made by Best Value Vacs, and there's many of them around. I mean, you can buy one right from Turntex. It's their own, you know, the Cactus Juice official vacuum chamber. I bought mine from Best Value Vacs. It doesn't matter. Mine's just like a big aluminum pot with a glass lid, and it has a pressure gauge on it. So, but what you want to do is you want to put the wood in, you stack the wood into your vacuum chamber. And if you look at the picture, you can see I have like a bucket inside my vacuum chamber. And that's, I'm going to put a some type of container in my vacuum chamber just because it's so big, so I don't have to put in as much resin to cover the wood. And what you want to do is you want to add enough resin so you can cover the wood at least by 1 inch or 2 inches. All right. And the reason for that is because once you release that vacuum after it has been under vacuum, that resin is going to get sucked into the wood. So you want to make sure that there's enough where, you know, the wood stays covered all the time. Okay. So after you have the wood in the resin and, you know, it's covering the resin, you might have to weigh it down. You can see here, I got a couple fishing weights on the wood holding it down so it doesn't float away, right? Then you turn on your vacuum pump and let that pump run. Recommendation is somewhere between 6 and 24 hours. The drier the wood is, the shorter the time should be, okay? But what you really want to do is you want to leave that vacuum pump run until it stops bubbling. And you can see on the slide, right, there's a lot of bubbles in there, and you would want to leave that run until the bubbles stop, okay? Okay, so after those bubbles have stopped, okay, then you're going to release the vacuum off your vacuum pot, okay, or vacuum chamber, right? And you're going to want to let the wood just soak in the resin, okay? And that soak time is going to allow the resin to get drawn into the wood because of that negative pressure because of the vacuum, right? They recommend that you leave the wood soak for 2 times longer than it was under vacuum. So obviously, if it was under vacuum for 10 hours, you should let it soak for at least 20. And I say at least 20 because it's never going to hurt it if you let it soak longer, okay? So to me, that's one of those things that's like, you know, when I do stabilizing, it's not something that I need to do right away. It's something that I'm just letting happen in another part of my shop. And okay, the stuff's soaking now. It might soak for days, you know, it's nothing that I have to get to, right? So after this stuff has soaked for an appropriate amount of time, all right, you're going to want to take the wood out of the resin and drain it, right? That resin can go back in the bottle and you can use it again. Any resin that that is still left in the your vacuum chamber is still usable. Put it back in the bottle, use it the next time, okay? So take the wood out, drain it, and then you're going to want to put that wood in an oven, and I just use a toaster oven. It's a big toaster oven, but it's a toaster oven at somewhere between 190 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not going to be bad if you make it hotter. And to be honest, what I do is I have my oven set at 220 because that's the temperature you need to cook the wood at to get the moisture out, and I don't change it. Okay, so I cure my resin at 220. The higher temperature is not going to hurt it. I use an oven thermometer to make sure that my temperature is right because those toaster ovens are notorious for having the temperature be wrong. So that's what I do. a recommendation from the people who make cactus juice say, to leave the thing in the oven so the internal temperature hits between 190 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit for at least like 15 or 20 minutes. I mean, it's almost like cooking a turkey, right? You got to wait until the internal temperature is a certain temperature, right? And they say that's going to take about an hour and a half for something the size of a pen blank, right? And you can see there in the picture that I have, I got like what, 3 pen blanks there stacked on top of each other, right? So for something small, obviously it doesn't have to be in the oven that long, but then you have bigger pieces, and some of the pieces I use for casting, they might have to be in there for days, So if I have to run the toaster oven for longer than I'm going to be in the shop, I generally will put it outside as long as it's not going to rain or something, because I just don't want to leave that thing running in the house or in my shop. And what you definitely don't want to do is you definitely don't want to take the thing inside and cook it in the oven in your house, or you won't be able to be in your house, because now we're back to those fumes again. Okay. The stuff stinks when it's being cooked. So you definitely don't want to be in the shop when you're doing that, unless you have like a separate room in your shop, which I don't. I mean, I'm in a, I think it's like 11 by 19 space. I mean, that's my shop space. So anything that's happening in my shop is right in my face for the most part, right? So it's like, usually if I'm going to cook the wood, it's just like, I'm done for the day in the shop. I'm going to turn on the oven and I'm going to leave the shop. And I'm going to leave the shop until bedtime. And if that's not long enough, I'll put the oven outside, right? And if it looks like it's going to rain or something, I might leave a window open or something for ventilation, okay? So, but you can see the stabilization is kind of cool. What it does is it draws the resin into the thing. It really kind of plasticizes the wood, and it will definitely stiffen up any punkiness that you have in any wood, okay? I put this picture in here because I just made this not too long ago. I got a message from somebody on Instagram, and they wanted to know if I could make them a handle for their portafilter. And there's a lot of steam and everything when you're making coffee, and it's like so close to where everything's being done. And we talked about it, and he asked if I could stabilize the piece of walnut. So that's why this is here. So it just doesn't have to be for like stabilizing burl to be used in like a hybrid situation or whatever. You just think about what the application is, and obviously if there's going to be a lot of moisture around this piece of walnut, now you don't have to worry about it. I mean, the entire thing has been sealed with stabilizing resin. So that worked out really well. All right, so before we go on, anybody have any questions so far about the whole stabilizing? Because that's really, if you have a question, ask. I didn't want to really kind of like go down that stabilizing road too much, only because I think, Scott, you told me that you were trying to set something up for somebody else, and I just didn't want to be redundant. So
Yeah, no, that was good, I thought. Have you ever used dyes in the process?
Not in stabilizing, but using a dye in any resin is kind of the same. I just have never felt like dyeing any of the wood that I use.
Okay.
So, but dyeing with other resins, absolutely yes. And we'll talk about that in just a bit.
Okay.
All right.
I have a question.
Sure.
After you stabilize the piece of wood, how does it react with like wood glues? I do a lot of segmented turning, and can something be glued up after it's stabilized?
Well, I can only tell you from my own personal experience, right? So the only glue, if you want to call it glue, that I've ever used on anything that's ever been stabilized would be epoxy, right? So I know that'll work. I mean, will like regular yellow wood glue work? To be honest, I don't know. I mean, I hate to give you a non-answer, but it's just nothing that I've ever tried before. So I really can't answer that question at all. I definitely know epoxy will hold things together, because you'll see that some of the things that I do are a piece of stabilized burl, and the rest of the whole project is epoxy, and it's not coming apart ever, right? So if you had to, put 2 pieces of wood together, the epoxy would definitely hold it together, right? But yeah, I can't tell you whether or not like actual wood glue would work.
All right, thanks.
Sure, sorry. Anything else? All right.
Can you put finishes like a polyurethane or a CA glue over would
I
that be?
put CA glue. I mean, I don't put polyurethane pretty much on anything for wood turning, to be honest. I mean, I just don't do it, but CA glue, absolutely. I've finished pens before, CA glue. Polyurethane for me personally, it just takes too long to cure, you know? So,
Thank you.
I mean, that's my own personal thing. To be honest, I've actually turned hollow forms before and sealed them either with penetrating epoxy, or I've actually sealed them before with CA glue and then just buff them with the Beal buffing system, and they come up beautiful and they stay that way. So, you know,
Great.
and then the finish is done. You know, it's not like I don't have to let it sit in the shop for, you know, a day in between coats, 3 coats. I don't know, you know, and I hate saying that, but it's just like, you know, when I left the whole flat woodwork world, right? Wood turning is awesome to me because like you get stuff done, right? I mean, you put something on the lathe and usually it's done within a few hours, or unless it's a big project, maybe a day or 2. Whereas when I did flat wood work, I mean, projects could take weeks, and it's just like, I don't know. I just have no patience, I guess. I don't know.
Thank you.
So, all right. All right.
I have a
So
question, Scott.
anybody else before we go on?
Yeah, Scott, I have a question.
Sure.
After your soak in the cactus juice and the final cure in the oven, do you wrap your pieces in foil or you just put them in bare?
Okay, actually, I'm glad you asked that because I forgot about something I was going to mention, and now I can mention that. So I don't wrap anything in foil, okay? Now, I know some people do, and the reason that you're to recommend that, you know, like Turntex, the people who make cactus juice, they recommend that you wrap things in foil if you're going to be curing things right next to each other so they don't fuse together like a giant blob, okay? You don't have to do that. But if the pieces are too close together, some of that cactus juice is going to leach out of those pieces. And then if they're too close together, they're going to just bond together, and it's just going to be like one giant mass, right? So I just separate things. I put down a piece of foil over top of the rack, the rack in my toaster oven, just so the stuff doesn't drip through, you know? And then I put pieces on top of that and I just leave them go. Now, some of the resin leaks out and everything, but it just kind of puddles around where the wood was, you know, and it's not much. And then to clean those pieces up, like those blanks that I showed you, and actually here, I'll just go back to that real quick on the slide. And let me find it first. There we go. All right, so I just took the excess resin that was on these pen blanks. I mean, I just touched them up to make them look pretty on a disc sander, okay? Now, the burl that's right next to it, none of those pins was covered with resin. I mean, the whole thing was soaked in resin, but all that burl area that everybody likes and it looks really pretty and everything, I actually took my compressor air hose and I took it outside my shop. You know, the hose is long, right? So I took the piece outside my shop, threw it on the ground, and I blew all the resin off of that area so it wouldn't have bits of resin on it when it cooked away, right? So the pieces come out clean. Now, there might be some resin on the bottom or the sides, but once again, you know, I'm taking it over to the disc sander just to get that stuff off so I can fit it into my molds. But you don't have to wrap anything in aluminum foil at all if you don't want to. But if you're going to put a bunch of stuff next to each other, you know, it probably is a good idea to wrap the stuff in aluminum foil just so they don't all fuse together in one giant blob. Does that kind of answer that question?
Perfectly, thank you.
Cool deal.
Thanks.
Anything else? All right. Let's get back to onward and upward. Okay, so here we got some general casting resin similarities. Okay, so they're all 2-part liquid. You have a resin and a hardener, or a part A and a part B, depending on the manufacturer and how they want to label everything, right? So you really got to be careful about the mix ratio between A and B, and you have to pay attention. Some things are mixed by weight, and you need a scale. And some things are mixed by volume, so you need, you know, mixing cups that actually have, you know, graduated measurements on them, so you can mix them by the proper ratio, right? But once you mix those together and mix it up, that there's going to be a chemical reaction that creates heat. And you can see my little bullet point, chemistry happens. Now, I'm not a chemist, so I can't tell you what all the chemical stuff happens. But, you know, over time, in a specific amount of time for curing, you basically wind up with a big giant lump of hard plastic. right? And that's what we're going for. Now that hard plastic, when it's still in liquid form, you can color it, dye it. You can use mica powders. You can do a lot of different things. I mean, here you can see I have the purple pen blank mold that block would be cut in half and would make 2 pen blanks, right? Or 2 handles for me is what I use it for. I mean, I don't generally make too many pens anymore, but I still use that mold to make handles for like bottle openers, which are extremely popular. For, you know, when I make bottle openers, every one of them sells. I usually get requests for more. It gets to the point where, like we were talking about earlier, Scott, right? I mean, I stopped making them because it's no fun anymore, right? So I tell people, oh, I'll make some other time, and then move on to something else. And then you can see the other thing where I'm pouring the resin into. I mean, that's like a 2x2x3 size mold, and that's kind of like, you know, a typical bottle stopper size mold, right? So, you know, color it, don't color it. You can put little swirls in it with some dyes, mica powders, give it that little shimmery look. There's plenty of things you can do with the resin. Okay, so here's some casting resin considerations. Now, this is kind of like the big question, right? When everybody says, well, what resin do you use? Well, a bunch of them is the answer I have to give, because a lot of them have different applications. Now, I've tried to pare that down to like a small set of resins that I use. And I've been very lucky with, you know, my relationship with Alumilite, the company itself. I've been very lucky with my work with the resins from Alumilite, the company, right? They all work good. They cater to people like us, crafters, you know, woodworkers, wood turners. This stuff works great. Some of the other stuff, like I have a picture here of Total Boat High Performance. It's very good, but I mean, Total Boat epoxy was not made for wood turners, right? You can use it. That stuff, actually, the high performance stuff works very well, but you know, I'm very happy with the products from Alumilite, and I'm not trying to do a commercial for them. They don't pay me. I do have to say I am an Alumilite affiliate, but I don't 100% know what that means, other than they gave me a discount code a long time ago that I was able to use once, and I'm supposed to tell everybody what it is, and I get a kickback, which I don't tell anybody what it is because I could care less. So I just wanted my own discount, you know? So, but anyway, the properties that you have to worry about with these resins, right, is working time, demold time, full cure time, and the depth that you can pour it. And so when I'm talking about the working time is how much time do you have from the time that you mixed part A and part B before the stuff starts to harden, right? That's your working time. Now that's going to vary greatly, okay, depending on which type of resin that you're using, right? So, I mean, just look at 5-minute epoxy, right? I mean, if you use 5-minute epoxy, I know we all kind of consider that a glue, but it's epoxy resin, right? And in about 4.5 minutes, that stuff starts setting up, right? So, you know, that's a very short working time. And you take something like, you know, epoxy, where you know, you might have like 7, 8, 9 hours of working time, and it needs to be that way. So it allows the bubbles to rise to the surface, because, and that way you can torch the bubbles off, because you want that, you know, that casting to be 100% clear, right? So that's going to vary depending on the resin, okay? So the demold time for resins that you're going to be used for molds, okay, is like, when's it hard enough that you can take it out of a mold, okay? Now I'm going to use Alumilite Clear Slow, which is a urethane resin, and I'm going to actually use that as an example, okay? So for the Clear Slow, the demold time is between 2 and 4 hours, depending on how large a pour you do. So you can actually take it out of the mold, and it's hard, but that resin isn't going to be fully cured until 5 days later, okay? So if it's a pen blank, can you turn it? Probably. It's probably not going to matter. If it's a big, giant 5-inch cube of resin, like I do for some of my resin spheres, can you turn it? You probably can, but it's going to shrink a little bit, and maybe that might not be the best thing for you, because now you'll be able to feel the seam between the wood and the resin when the thing's finished, right? And that's probably not the best, right? So you really got to pay attention to those numbers, right? And the other thing, you know, the last bullet point on there would be the depth of pour, okay? Now, there's going to be some resins that are going to be labeled as deep pour. Okay. Now I've dealt with a few different companies, and I'm not going to name what they all are, and they all advertise they have deep pour resins, but you have to read the label, because some of their deep pour resins will let you pour something as deep as like 1.5 inches or maybe 2 inches. And if you need to pour something that's 5 inches, 2 inches isn't a deep pour, right? So, you know, but if they're only making pen blanks, then it probably doesn't matter. So, you know, you really got to pay attention to the manufacturer's suggestion on what they consider the maximum pour depth for their resin, okay? So, as I said, those properties can vary greatly resin to resin, and, you know, from 5 minutes to 5 days, depending on which property you're talking about. I mean, that's a big swing, right? So you got to find the right resin for your project, right? All right. So once again, your casting resins are going to break down into 3 major types: polyester resin, urethane resins, and epoxies. But which one's the best for your project? It really depends on your project, you know? So you're going to have to kind of say, like, well, what do I need to accomplish? And so what is the best tool to make that work, right? So it's kind of like really like picking the best tool for the job, you know? I mean, it's definitely going to be like, you know, Alumilate resin, and I keep saying that, Alumilate Clear Slow, you know, and it's just like, I use this stuff so much, I put it on the shelf up behind me, right? Alumilate Clear Slow is my favorite casting resin ever, right? But I can't use it to fill cracks on a bowl. You can't. Absolutely 100% cannot. Well, if you did, it's just not going to work right. Maybe I should say that, because you can do whatever you want, right? But it's not going to work the way you want it to, right? You're going to want to use something that is more like a deep pour epoxy, or something that is made that's like, you know, very thin viscosity, that's going to fill up those cracks. It's going to get into all the nooks and crannies. It's going to take a long time to cure, so the bubbles will have a chance to escape, right? You don't want anything viscous at all, because that just traps bubbles, right? And then you're going to want to just sit and let the thing cure for as long as it takes. I mean, it might take 24 hours, it might take 48 hours, it might take 72 hours, right? It might take longer. I mean, it just depends on the resin, okay? All right. So let's talk about polyester resin for just like about 20 seconds, and then we're never going to talk about it ever again, okay? So I put this in the presentation because it exists. It exists and it's available. But you know, I don't know how big your computer screens are. If you read those warnings, you know, danger, may be harmful, blah, 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 breathing vapors, blah, 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 can cause blindness. That's like, I'm not bringing that stuff into my shop. I've never used polyester resin. The reason I have never used it is because everybody who's ever used it says don't use it. And I don't need to make that same mistake that other people have made. So I'm not going to use it. There's other things out there that do not have this toxicity level. There's really not much of an advantage to using polyester that I know of. I mean, the fumes are toxic. It's a brittle resin, so it'll chip a lot when you're working it. It has a long open time, so it's you don't have to be really fast about what you're doing, but it also has an extremely slow cure time, so it's going to take a long time for it to set up. So, you know, if you want to try it, great. I mean, a lot of people use it. This is actually, I stole this picture from Michael's. So it's available in the, you know, basically just regular craft shops, but it's not coming in my shop, right? All right, so then we're going to talk about epoxies, okay? Now, epoxies, like I said before, is kind of like more like of a family, right? More than it is a thing, right? So there's so many different types of epoxies for so many different formulations, so many different uses, so many applications. You got to find the one that you know fits your project. Now, the nice thing about epoxies is that most of them have a very good workability, you know, with their turning tools. Most of them, less fumes, okay? Now, I told you about my problem that I had with Total Boat Original, okay? But I did not have anywhere near that problem at all with Total Boat's high performance epoxy, right? As a matter of fact, that stuff's great. I mean, I love that stuff. I mean, the original stuff I don't ever have to use. That stuff was made for boats anyway, so... but yeah, so I have no problem with the high performance epoxy. It's worked out really well for me in a few projects. So, okay, so you do have longer working time with most epoxies, okay? And slower cure time, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if it's something that you can't get into a pressure pot. We'll talk about that more later as well, right? But if you just have to let the thing cure in your shop with no pressure, okay, just curing out in the open, you want that long open time or long working time or slower cure time, because it lets those bubbles escape from the resin, and you're going to put bubbles in the resin because you're mixing it, right? You're going to mix it up. It's going to put bubbles in there. You want those bubbles to escape. All right. All right. So for all the resins, not just epoxy, but for all the resins, the wood needs to be dry. But I actually like put mostly in quotes here because epoxy seems to be a little bit more forgiving than the urethane resins. Okay. So if I wanted to, do something just with like a piece of like wood that's been sitting in my shop for about a year and a half, am I going to put that in the oven to dry it out before I put epoxy on it? No, not at all. It should be fine, right? Not so much though with the urethane resins. They'll talk about that in a little bit. Right? So, but it says mostly dry, right? And the other nice thing about most of the epoxies is that they polish up pretty nice. You really have to, once again, read the data sheet that comes with all the epoxy or that's found on the manufacturer's website, because the harder that epoxy is, the better it's going to polish. Okay, and that just makes sense, right? I mean, I think that would just make sense to anybody, right? Now, another thing that I have found, and because of my workflow, I like to polish most of my stuff with the Beal buffing system. And it works really good as long as the resins have a high heat resistance. Now, something like epoxy, which does not have a high heat resistance, it doesn't like to be polished with the Beal buffing system. It starts to get soft and it starts to smear. So, once again, it's going back and doing your research and finding out which resins work best for you for your application.
Hey, Scott.
Yes.
Hey, Scott. It's Joe Nesselrode. How you doing?
Hi, Joe. I know who you
Hi.
are.
Yeah, hi. So quick question on the epoxies. I just bought some of the West System epoxy resin. I got the 105 resin and the 206 slow hardener. Do you have any experience with the West System?
I've never used the West System stuff before. I know some people who have. And, once again, it's either someone I know either from Instagram that has, and we've had conversations, or it's like, some stuff I've got off of, and this is like, I'm going to give you some information on Zach Higgins when we're done. Zach Higgins, to me, I mean, he runs a YouTube channel. All he talks about is resin. He's like the resin king, right? And Zach and I became friends a few years ago, and he is, if I have a resin question, I ask Zach. Right? If he doesn't know it, I don't think anybody does. He's like one of those type of people, right? So, but I'm pretty sure Zach has done a shootout of all the resins, and Joe, the resin's fine.
Okay,
for its application.
So I got it mainly to fill large voids, like in bowls and platters. Fairly large voids, obviously not cracks. So,
okay, but when you say large voids, I mean, I guess everything's a relative term.
Yeah,
right?
like this, like wormholes, like up size of a dime or a nickel, things like.
Yeah, so that's probably going to be fine, to be honest, right? And you're not going to know until you try it. But like, and you'll see, I have a pepper grinder that had a huge bark inclusion in it, and I took a lot of time and dug it all out. And if I would have used something like West Systems, or if I would have used the original Total Boat, I think it might have got too hot during curing, and it probably would have affected the cure, right? So I use something else, right?
Okay.
Now, to me, I always try to err on the side of caution. And once again, I tend to gravitate back to things that I know that work, now that I have things that work. You know what I mean?
Okay.
So it's like the old, if it's not broke, don't fix it, right?
Okay.
So, and that's kind of my mindset anymore. It's just like, you'll see, it's like, we'll talk about, I mean, we've talked extensively. I use Alumilite every time I possibly can use Alumilite because it just suits my needs, right? If I can't use that, I use another Alumilite product, and it's usually going to be their amazing clear cast or their amazing deep pour, and all they are is just like variants of epoxy, just like everybody else has their own epoxy, right? But I know how they work, and I know how to work them, You know what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
like that's kind of like where I go with, and it's like, if you could experiment with that West Systems,
I'm
and
going, yeah,
just like
definitely.
everything else. I mean, start small, see how it works out, build up bigger and bigger and bigger, but don't do like what I did. And I don't know if you're here for that, but you
No,
know,
yeah, I've been
when I
here.
took that, okay, so then you heard the turtle boat thing with
Yeah.
no, don't start out like something like that, because that's a disaster. I
Right,
mean,
right,
especially in
yeah.
your shop, dude. I mean, come on, your shop's nicer than my house.
Thanks. Oh, yeah, please. Yeah, but
But
yeah,
you
I
know,
just,
my wife calls your shop. I mean, not to go off the beaten track, but my wife calls your shop. She goes, Joe, that's that guy with that shop that's so nice you could eat in it, right? Every
I
time.
do eat here. I eat,
So,
I eat pretty much every meal here in front of my computer. Yeah. All
right.
right. Thanks,
all
Scott.
right. So hopefully I answered your question, Joe. I
Yeah.
mean, and if you have any other questions, obviously I'll answer any questions you have whenever you have them.
All right,
So
thank
it's all
you.
cool. Yep. All right. So no picture on this or anything, and I try to put pictures on all the slides. But I mean, okay, so epoxies, right? I mean, I think I drove the point home. They're not all the same. The working time can vary greatly. The viscosities can range from anything to like as thin as water to something like Caro syrup, right? I mean, it's like it can get really, really thick. And if for different purposes, right? Some of those thicker epoxies, right? Some people use them to like coat like drinking tumblers that they do for like crafts, right? They'll buy the tumbler and they'll put some type of graphic on it, and then they'll coat that with this viscous epoxy, and it won't come off. I mean, it'll just stay on there, and they put it like on a very slow rotating mandrel type thing, and it cures perfectly. So everything has its own use, right? So just finding the right tool for the job, right? But you can find epoxies. They're good for anything from pen blanks to river tables. You just need to use the right one. All right. So moving forward from here, I should do this, right? Put me back on here. Moving forward from here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to give you some, I guess it might be more like anecdotal information about the resins that I've personally used. Okay. So this is going to be stuff that I've actually used, stuff that I had good luck with, some stuff that I didn't have good luck with. So if I can save you guys a little bit of money or flatten your learning curve, I'm all about that, right? So let's talk about art resin. Art resin is the only resin I know that on their website it says it's 100% food safe. All right. There's a lot of other resins that will say they are food contact safe. I don't know what the difference is. Art resin actually, like, that's the big thing for them, is they have some certification from the FDA that they're food safe. So use that knowledge for what it's worth. And you can see here, I mean, I use some art resin to fill cracks in bowls, right? That's just a regular eating bowl. I don't have to worry about being like, hey, well, that has chemical, blah, 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 plastic, blah, blah, blah. No, art resin says it's 100% food safe, right? So I don't worry about it. And art resin will let me pour, an appropriate amount for that type of repair. It is also thin enough, viscosity wise, that it will fill the entire crack. It is open enough, or it takes long enough to cure where all the bubbles will come to the top. I'm perfectly happy with using something like this for a crack repair, right? I'm not going to use to make a resin sphere, okay? One of the problems with art resin is it says you're only supposed to pour it in 1/8 inch layers. And in their frequently asked questions, it says, how deep a pour? And their answer is, you can pour art resin as deep as you want, as long as you do it 1/8 of an inch at a time, right? So apparently you can layer it. But obviously, if you're layering it and letting it cure, it's going to take a long time. Okay.
So this
if you have
is
that kind
more,
of time or whatever, but
sorry.
I don't. I mean, I just don't want to be I don't want to spend my time layering resin. Okay.
This would be
So,
more for small cracks then.
yes.
Very good.
Right. So some people make little things with them, like little craft things, whatever. I mean, it's just like everybody has their own. It's just another epoxy, but the properties of this, at least for me, for wood turning, it lends more to something like a repair. Okay. So this was something, this bowl here, I used art resin. I have a platter here that I think we showed at the first state meeting, show and tell, 1 month. And that whole big bark inclusion is filled with resin, okay? It's filled with art resin. It's like we use this platter in my house, right? It's 100% food safe. The rest of the finish on that piece is walnut oil. That's just me. Now I know every finish is, major finish is supposed to be food safe once it's fully cured. My food contact wood is walnut oil. So that's, like I said, me personally. But that was filled with art resin and a great repair, right? This piece was also done with art resin because I didn't have to pour it all that deep. This basically was a piece of sycamore, and I turned a channel in the blank. So you got to imagine that the blank extends past the rim of this bowl, right? And I drilled a channel and I filled up that channel with a bunch of sticks and I poured art resin in there. Okay. Seemed to work for that. Now, the sticks probably weren't dry enough because there are a little bit of some bubbling around those sticks because once again, I mean, you got to worry about the moisture and I really didn't pay attention to that. But I probably could have put those sticks and dried them out in the oven. I wouldn't have had that problem at all. And any bubbles that rise to the top on art resin, you can just use like a torch and blow torch those right off, right? And they'll just go right away. All right. So some different ideas of what to use. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Ecopoxy. Now, Ecopoxy has changed their entire line because when I bought Ecopoxy, they made liquid plastic. Okay. And it came in 2 different variants, right? And I bought the wrong one. So, but the bottom line is the Ecopoxy, at least this liquid plastic Ecopoxy, was really designed for river tables. Okay, it really wasn't designed for what I do, right? I did try pouring this into a 4-inch cube to encapsulate a flower, and it worked fine. Okay, and it was nice and hard and everything, but like we talked about a little bit earlier, when I went to go buff it, and the system that I use to buff things is, dry sanding up to a certain grit, and then I polish it, right? I mean, with some polishing wax, and then I use the Beal buffing system. Well, that Beal buffing system creates a lot of heat, and that heat started to melt the Ecopoxy. So not so good for me. Now, if I wanted to spend the time and wet sand it all, I probably could have polished it up and it would have been beautiful, but that takes a lot of time, and I don't want to spend that time if I can use a different product and have it done quicker. So that's really what it comes down to. So, but the Ecopoxy has a long open time, a long cure time. They say excellent air release, and really what that is it's just thin. The viscosity is thin enough to let the bubbles come to the top, right? But I did have a problem where it didn't really buff out well. Okay, but that's my own personal experience, right? Okay, so on to Total Boat. I'm not going to beat you to death with that same story about the original Total Boat, right? Fumes, heat. The only thing I didn't mention is it has a natural yellow color, right? So is that good or bad? If you want something to look like amber, then that's good, right? If you want something to be crystal clear, then you definitely don't want to use the original Total Boat epoxy, right? Now the high performance is clear, right? So, and the high performance has less fumes and it creates less heat and it still hardens very nicely and it polishes well. So if I was going to go with a Total Boat product, I would go, steer more towards their high performance resin. If that's, you're into Total Boat epoxy, right? Okay, so you remember that 4-inch cube that I put with Total Boat? This was it, right? So it was full of bubbles because I couldn't get it into the pressure pot, right? So lots of tiny bubbles inside the casting. That big, it looks kind of like this really cool looking thing in the middle of that sphere is really a heat crack, right? It got so hot that it cracked internally. Now, it's all encased in resin and it looks kind of cool, but probably not what you want to do, right? Now, Total Boat, when I was making the resin, well, I shouldn't say when I was making, I still make them, but maybe about a year and a half ago, Total Boat Epoxy sent me some epoxy and they wanted to see if I could turn one of my resin spheres using their epoxy. And this epoxy would get so hot. I mean, I didn't do it, but it would get so hot it would melt the toy inside, right? That's the heat this generates, right? So I knew that just from mixing the 2 parts, and it really got hot really fast. So that was my experience with Total Boat. But high performance Total Boat, not the original. I have a video that I'll show a little bit later of me making something with that. So same company, two different products, right? All right. So then we're going to go into Alumilites epoxies, which is the ones I generally tend to gravitate towards, right? And this is Alumilites Amazing Clear Cast or Amazing Clear Cast Plus. And the difference being is the Clear Cast Plus has this enhanced UV stability. So they put some additive in there that's supposed to make it so it doesn't yellow as fast, because all resins are going to yellow a little bit over time. But properties here, it's clear, and it is almost crystal clear. Low odor, it's food contact safe, it has good workability, but it's a viscous resin. I mean, it really is thick, right? So that would be good if you wanted to put a coating of resin on something, or if you just have like a little crack or something that you might want to fill, but you're going to want to hit that with maybe a heat gun or something, right? To get that resin to flow better. But there's a better solution. But if this is the only resin that you have, I mean, I would still use it to fill cracks, right? It's very easy to polish. It gets really hard. It's pretty heat resistant. I've actually used this resin before to seal burl and put some color on it for some of the resin spheres that I do. Okay, so basically I painted it on almost like a paint, you know, and it stayed on the surface. It didn't run off, you know, so I put some color in it with some micas and some dyes. And so that was kind of like, you know, a total win for that, you know, for that particular situation. All right. Now, this is Alumilite's Amazing Deep Pour Epoxy. Now, this is kind of like one of the most unique products, I think, that's out there for wood turners. This is actually marketed as deep pour and turning epoxy. So they're kind of thinking about you, right? Thinking about me, thinking about us as woodworkers, right? So the big claim is the #1 bullet point on there. They say you don't need a pressure pot. And for the most part, you don't, right? And you'll see when I talk about Alumilite Clear and Alumilite Clear Slow, you absolutely 100% do need to use a pressure pot or your casting will be full of bubbles. This is very low viscosity, bubbles rise to the surface. You can color it, you can tint it, and you don't have to worry about putting in a pressure pot. But what you do have to worry about is it's hours before the stuff even starts to solidify. Like literally, if you came out probably like after like 8 or 9 hours, you'd probably still be able to put your finger right in your mold, right into the epoxy, just like it was liquid. So it sits for a long time. So, I mean, if you have a lot of time and you don't have a pressure pot, obviously time not an issue, you could use this stuff and you could cast a lot of things. So it's also, it hardens very well and it polishes very well, right? Here's a couple pieces, like these are just castings now, right? Here's some castings that I did with either Amazing Clear Cast or Amazing Deep Pour. Okay. And now, Joe, it's like when we were talking a little bit earlier, you say you wanted to fill voids, right? And you'll see that this tall piece here is a piece of cherry, right? And I used the deep pour, okay? Because I needed to fill a pretty big void. I mean, the entire thing was mostly hollow. So, you know, I know that stuff's going to do with the right, you know, it's going to work. It's going to do the right job. I can pour that stuff that deep and not worry about it, right? These other pieces, the big circular piece eventually became a hollow form, and that may or may not be in the slideshow. I'm sorry, I just don't remember. And then the other two pieces, the smaller pieces, one of them is a tool handle, or became a tool handle, and the other one, the cube, is a shift, and became a shift knob. So, you know, you can, you know, pretty much make whatever you want, cast different pieces for whatever you want, and you don't necessarily need a pressure pot. Now, I do have to say that the pieces that were made out of Amazing Clear Cast did go in the pressure pot, okay? So I'm going to put every casting in the pressure pot unless it's Amazing Deep Pour, okay? And then I'm only going to not put that in the pressure pot because I'm just really being overly cautious if it's too big to fit in the pressure pot, okay? So anyway, that tool handle, right? This is a little carver's mallet, right? And that's the handle from that picture in there. You can see that polished up very nicely, right? And that was that amazing deep pour epoxy, no pressure pot. All right. All right, so now we're going to go on to urethanes. Okay, so the only urethane resin I've ever used is Alumilite's clear or clear slow. Okay, and the difference between the two really is just how much time do you have to work the resin. Okay, so either of them, they both have good workability. It's almost no fumes at all. I mean, I can't smell the stuff at all when I've mixed it together. I mean, I'm, you know, the downside to both of these is the working time. You have a very short amount of time from when A and B mix together to get whatever you're doing done. I use the clear slow because you have 12 minutes of working time. The Alumilite clear, you have 7 minutes of working time, and that 7 minutes is not a lot of time, especially when you're talking, you have to mix it, and while you're mixing it, the clock's running. And then you're going to mix in like a color and the clock's running. And then you're going to put in some mica powder and the clock's still running, and you have to make sure it's mixed thoroughly. And now you've run out of time. I mean, the stuff needs to get into the pressure pot before your time runs out, or the thing's going to just be full of bubbles. Okay. The other thing, negative, is the wood needs to be very dry. And how dry is very dry? The surface of the wood has to be bone dry, or you'll get foaming. Right. And to get it bone dry, I don't care if it's a piece that I've, you know, like a mallee burl where it's so dense that I don't have to worry about stabilizing, or if it's a piece of maple burl that I did stabilize. Before I put Alumilite on it, it's going back in the toaster oven at least for like 10, 15 minutes to cook any surface moisture off, because I've had issues with that surface moisture being enough to get this resin to bubble right at the surface, the contact surface between the resin and the wood. Okay, so a plus on this stuff is fast demold time. I mean, you literally can do small projects in the same day. You know, I mean, an hour or two, you know, maybe 2 or 3 hours, you can demold the stuff and you can be turning the stuff depending on how big the piece is, right? I mean, Alumilite says that the full cure time is 5 days. If it's a bigger piece, I'm definitely going to wait, but small pieces like bottle stoppers and pens, I wouldn't be all that concerned, to be honest. I've had no problem turning those and they'd turn fine, right? It is extremely hard and it's extremely heat resistant. So therefore it polishes very, very well. Okay. All right. I kind of covered most of this stuff. Just rattling on about what we were talking about before. So
Scott,
I'm not going to go over it again. Yes.
I have a quiz for you.
What's up?
Okay, you tell me your favorite product for the following projects. So 5x5 cube.
Oh, definitely. Well, are we casting it just by itself or with wood?
Assuming wood and resin.
Okay, so we're doing a hybrid, right?
All hybrids. Yep.
I'm either going to dry that wood out, like if it's a mallee burl, and you'll see a lot of the spheres I do, I use like either a red or brown mallee burl, right? It's extremely dense. That stuff's going in the oven probably for like hours, right?
Okay.
Then I'm going to let it cool down, and then I'm going to cast with Alumilite, clear, slow, every time. And you'll see I don't use anything other than, for all the resin spheres that I make, I don't use any, unless I'm experimenting, I don't use anything other than Alumilite clear slow.
Okay, so that's your go-to for a large.
Alumilite clear slow. There's really no difference between clear and clear slow, other than I have a little bit extra time, and it's only 5 minutes more, right? 7 or 12 minutes.
Okay.
And you need the 5 minutes.
Got it. Okay, how about 2-inch flat work for like a cheese board or something like that?
Okay, so I don't necessarily know that I have it in a slide, right? But I did a project and it was a collaboration with, you know, another Instagrammer, right? And it's Annie's Woodworks, and she made this beautiful cutting board, and there was a hole in it, right? And that hole was a 3-inch circle hole that was in there. I put a piece of burl in there, and I couldn't put that in my pressure pot. So now I'm doing exactly what you talk about, right? So I put the piece of burl in there, I put a little Star Wars toy in there, and I filled the thing up with amazing deep pour.
Okay.
Okay. Didn't have to put it in a pressure pot. All the bubbles came to the surface. The casting was crystal clear. If I show you a picture, you won't think that there's any resin in it at all because that's how clear the resin is, right?
Okay.
Torch the bubbles off on the top.
And you can
think I'm a
you
beautiful.
can do colors and mica and all.
Yes, all the resins all basically the same. You can put micas in them, colors in them, whatever.
Okay. You said for small cracks, you'd consider the art resin.
Art resin for me mostly because it's like small cracks that I'm talking about, like for like food service bowls,
Yeah.
right? And it's just maybe it's just my mindset, but that art resin, being able to say that they're 100% food safe, that's a big deal, And it's just like I don't want to explain to somebody if you're making something for yourself, it probably doesn't matter. But like if you're selling something or giving something away to somebody, and they go, "Oh, this is really nice, but I mean, can I put food in this?" If I tell them that my finish is walnut oil, they can eat walnut oil, right? Anybody can, right? And if I tell them that was filled with resin that's 100% food safe, they're happy. If I say, well, it's food contact safe, the first thing they ask me is, what does that mean? And you know what? I don't know.
Yeah. Right.
Right?
Okay. How about filling large cracks?
Large cracks, probably deep pour. Aluminite deep pour. And I have to say that, amazing deep pour.
Yeah.
99% of all the time that I'm using any resin right now, it's going to be one of the Aluminite products just because I've become so familiar with them and they're easy to use, right?
Okay. How about assemblies? Like you made that one thing with the pen blanks, and I see people make things with, 10 boxes of colored pencils and.
Well, I have a video for that, and we talked about that. That video, you'll see the resin I used for that was that now it's not a food contact item, it's just the box, right?
Right.
And I used the Total Boats high performance resin. It's great
Okay.
stuff. It gets really hard, it polishes really easy, and it's nothing that I have to worry about being in contact with food. And since it's an epoxy and not a urethane resin, I didn't have to stabilize the wood necessarily, didn't have to make sure it was bone dry. Now I could have stabilized the wood, but didn't have to.
So you could do the same thing for like bottle stoppers and things like that, right?
Yes.
Okay. Does anybody else have another scenario that I didn't cover? Okay. Well, we have a couple of questions in the pile here, so I thought I'd cover them now.
Sure.
So one question was about the best resin for UV blocking. And I know you mentioned one that was resistant for the resin itself, but how about if you were coating a piece of wood with resin, would you use a different product?
I would probably just use the stuff that Aluminite makes, the Amazing Clear Cast Plus.
Right.
Because I know that has additives for UV blocking, right? So,
right.
Like I said, I'm not that I'm a commercial for Aluminite, but it's like I'm going to gravitate towards stuff that I know.
No apologies necessary. Second question: someone has West Systems epoxy for 15 years. Can she use it?
I would check with the manufacturer about their shelf life, because a lot of those resins, they'll tell you that they might be good for. I've seen them as short as 6 months, and most of them ones I've seen have never been longer than 2 years.
Okay.
So the only exception to that rule was Eco Epoxy, and I asked them what their shelf life was, and they said they don't have one.
Right. Okay.
So.
And last question is, how deep can you pour the clear slow?
Well, I can only tell you how deep I've poured it, and I've poured things, I think, at like the deepest I've poured clear slow was a 7-inch pour. Okay, so it's 7 inches deep and probably about maybe 10 inches around.
Okay.
Like the better part of like a little bit over a gallon of resin in one pour-ish.
I think that brings us up to date, unless anybody has anything they want to ask verbally.
So I see that I came up, where do I store my supplies, right? So, well, most of the resins I just leave in my shop. Now I have a heater in my shop, so my shop doesn't get really too cold, Now it gets colder in the winter, because my heater is not the greatest heater in the world, but I mean, it'll be 60 degrees out here, and that's perfectly fine for storing the resin. Now, I might not be able to pour, projects, because some resins require it to be about 70 degrees, right? So I might not be able to use the resin, but I can store it. And then there's other things like the cactus juice, right? That if it gets warmer out here, and I have a thermometer, it's like literally like, right here, right? If my shop gets too hot, right, that cactus juice, if it gets above, like, I think it's 85 degrees, you got to throw it away. So if it starts getting too warm out here, that stuff goes back and forth into the house with me, because the house has air conditioning and my shop does not. And then I put it in the laundry room. It's the only place I can put it in my house where my wife won't yell at me, right? So. Anything else?
Looks like one more just came in. Without a pressure pot, you would recommend the Amazing Deep Pour, correct?
Amazing Deep Pour is specifically marketed so you don't need a pressure pot. That's how they market it. I know people who have made handle size castings, like stuff like I showed you with the mallet, bottle opener handles. I know people have made bottle stoppers with it. Now I do know that my friend Zach Higgins, right, we talked about him, right? He tried to pour that Amazing Deep Pour, and it's well beyond the factory specifications, in like a 9x9 cube. It got too hot and cracked. Okay. But I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, that was like almost like 2 gallons of resin at one pour for something that, is only supposed to be poured like about maybe 2 to 3 inches deep. Right. So, when they say 2 to 3 inches deep, it really kind of like, it'd be easier for me when I show you some of the pictures, right? Because like when you have other stuff in there, especially when you're making like hybrid blanks, right? I mean, it's never really going to be that much space where the resin is really that big, right? I mean, just imagine if I fill up a bucket with cubes, right, of wood, and I pour a bunch of resin in, it looks like I filled up the bucket with resin, but I didn't. It's still filled mostly with wood, right? So the resin's really not that deep.
Got it.
Per se. Does that make sense? Right? Anything else?
Nope.
Cool deal. All right. Back to the boring slideshow. All right. So really to kind of talk about Alumilite to death and not going to kill it, right? But here's some stuff, obviously some castings out of Alumilite. You can see we already showed you the pen blank thing here. Here's a couple bottle stoppers or bottle stopper sized pieces, right? And that blank I have there for one of my resin spheres is actually in my hand, and not that you can see it because I have the camera on the slideshow, but right, that's it. So when people want to know how big these are, a lot of people ask, I mean, that's this 5x5 cube, right? 5x5 cube is a half a gallon of resin. Okay. I mean, that's what this is. All right. When I turn the 4x4 cube, okay, it's a quart of resin, right? So, I mean, really, this is 60, I mix up like, I think 62 ounces to fill this, okay? And the other one's usually about 30, okay, the 4-inch cube, all right? So there's a lot of resin, right? So once again, we talked about how expensive the resin is. I mean, you really want to make sure that you have the right product for the right job, because obviously that can get expensive if you made a mistake, saying, hey, I wonder if I'm going to do this with Total Boat. You know what I mean? That's just an expensive experiment. Or you can use Alumilite, put it in a pressure pot, and it'll come out looking like this, like 99 times out of 100. And I have to say that because I did, Scott, I had a failure, and I posted that right on my Instagram account. It was horrible. Still don't know why, and thing's full of bubbles, but 99 times out of 100, that was the only blank that I ever cast that ever had that problem. Right? So who knows why, right? All right. So getting back to the slides, right? So your resin casting, basic supplies. What do you need to do resin casting? You're going to need molds, okay? You're also going to need mixing cups, mixing sticks, mica powders, dyes, blah, 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 right? And a bunch of other stuff, all right? I'm going to kind of blow through these slides because I'm looking at the clock and we have about a half hour-ish left. Is that right, Scott? About a half hour?
Scott, I'm happy as long as you want to go, but some people will
Okay.
get tired at around 9 o'clock. So.
Yeah, so that's why I'm shooting to be done at 9, right? Okay, so when we talk about molds, I mean, what can be molds, right? Well, anything can be a mold, right? I have the first thing on the list is tape. So you saw that piece that I had that had a crack in it. I basically put tape up the sides of that bowl and poured the resin in at the rim. Does that make sense? So, I mean, the tape on the sides held the resin in, and it just, you know, it went down from the crack at the top and filled all that void and solidified from there, right? So you can use tape, or if you have a knot, you can tape the inside of the knot and pour the resin on the outside. And that, when I do that, I just build up a little bit of a dam with some hot melt glue around the knot so the resin doesn't go pouring out all over the place, right? You can see here in the picture that I used this soda box. I actually blew the side off of this bowl, and one of my Instagram followers basically begged me to save that bowl and not waste it. So they bought it, so, you know, whatever. But I put some pine cones in between the two pieces of Coca-Cola box, filled the rest up with resin. So people use that corrugated plastic with molds, and they hold it all together with hot glue. I've used mixing cups before as molds. So you pretty much can use whatever you want, or you can use commercial molds, right? And I have two pictures of commercially made molds. One's Lizard Blanks. A lot of people have heard of them. And then this other company is called P-Town Subby. I have 2 Lizard Blank molds. The rest of them are P-Town Subby. I like this system of taking them apart better, right? I'm not a fan of the wing nuts. They look great. It seems like a good idea, but they're more trouble than they're worth. And I think you'll see that when we get into demolding a piece that I have on a video, right? So let's just plow on through. Okay, so mixing cups and sticks. To be honest, I think they're pretty self-explanatory, except you want to make sure that your cups, the sides of the cups are smooth. They don't have any ridges or anything, because you're going to be scraping the sides when you mix it, because you want to make sure that all the resin is mixed properly. Because if it's not, it won't cure right, okay? And especially the smaller amount of resin that you have, the more important it is to scrape the sides of the mixing cup, okay? That ratio becomes very critical if the amount of resin is small. All right. You can color your resins with micas or dyes. I generally use Alumilite dyes because I'm using Alumilite products. I 100% know Alumilite dyes are going to work with their material, right? Some dyes don't work well with other people's resins. So, and how do you know? I guess by experimentation. And resin's too expensive. I bought Alumilite dyes, right? Now the mica powders are a little bit different. Mica powder. Doesn't matter whose you buy. I have some here from Stardust. I have some here from Diamond. The thing with micas is a percentage of how much color you add to your resin. And I have 12%, 4%, 6%, and that's because I went to different places, and those are the numbers that I got. So obviously there's a little bit of a variance on what the consensus is, but I mean, 12%, you know, of putting 12% color into your, it's going to be a lot. I mean, so I wouldn't really worry so much about that, right? The dyes, this Alumilite dye is super concentrated, and you'll see when during the video, but that Alumilite dye, a little bit goes a long way. All right. Everything else that you're going to need, you might need mold release depending on the materials. The molds that I have from P-Town Subby, they're made out of that high density polyethylene. It naturally does not stick to the resin. And you'll see with me demolding a piece, I don't need mold release at all. But if you're using something like a homemade mold, where you're using like corrugated plastic or like some melamine from like, you know, Home Depot or something, you're going to want to spray a mold release on it so the mold doesn't stick to your casting, right? If you're going to be using Alumilite or any other resin that makes you measure it by weight, okay? Because that's going to be your 2 choices, right? Some resins require measurement by volume. Some require measurement by weight. You're going to need a digital scale if you're going to have to measure it by weight. And other than that, you know, the amazing deep pour where they say you don't need a pressure pot, everything else I put in the pressure pot if I possibly can, okay? If it fits in my pressure pot and I have a big pressure pot, I put it in the pressure pot, all right? Let's go to that, pressure pot. You can buy a commercially available one, or mine's basically just like a paint tag that's been converted, all right? All I did was I pulled out the pickup tube for the paint, and I removed the stir in the middle. I put a big giant bolt in there and put some rubber washers on it. put some thread lock on the bolt that holds everything together, and it doesn't leak air, okay? And you can see here, it's like, you can see the bolt that I used right in the middle to take out that stir. And then you can see that open spot there. That's where the pickup was for the paint. And on the other side, there's, you know, some regulated valves. I just leave them closed, okay? All right, let's talk about hybrids. And what is a wood and resin hybrid is anything where you combine the two, right? Resin and wood. And here you can see the bowl I was talking about with the pine cones. That was the one I used with the cardboard box. And you can see this picture here with this big bowl with a crack in it. And what I was talking about before with the tape. I mean, I just put tape up along the outside of that crack and up along the inside. And I poured the resin at the top on the rim, and all the resin went down into the crack and completely filled it, right? As 100% win for that. And you can see some pens here that some blanks I made to make some pens. And you can see I made a little bottle stopper. It looks like a little mini resin sphere. And then of course, some of the Star Wars pieces, right? All hybrids, right? And what do you need to make a hybrid? You're gonna need the resin, all the stuff we talked about with resin, some different types of wood, molds, blah, 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 right? It's all the same, right? Okay, what wood can you use? I've used pine cones. Obviously, there's a piece of the red mallee burl that I use. That bucket is full of cubes of holly that are like 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch. Those are all going to be stabilized and made into a hollow form. The pine cones I've used in a hollow form, but I'll show you some of that. I got some pictures here. Okay, so your wood, do you need to stabilize it? It really kind of depends. If your wood is extremely dense, like the mallee, like the Australian burls, you don't really need to stabilize it, but you're still going to need to cook that moisture off, right? Anything like a maple burl or anything like more like a domestic burl, I definitely would 100% stabilize that if it'll fit into my pressure pot. I'm sorry, into my vacuum chamber. If I can't do that, what I'll do is I'll seal the surface either with penetrating epoxy or you know, maybe painting on some cactus juice and cooking that. I've never tried that before, but like I said, I have some friends who have, and they've had some pretty good luck with that. But I have the penetrating epoxy, so that's what I use, okay? But you're definitely gonna wanna seal that surface. What's gonna happen is if you just pour a resin over top of bare wood, the resin's going to heat up, it's going to expand the air that's in the wood, and that air is going to come out of the pores, and it's going to create bubbles in your resin, right? Okay, so which resin? Now we've already went over this since you did the question and answer, so we're not going to go over it again, right? So which resin? It's just pick the right resin for the right job and you'll be fine. All right. So here's basically what I use, right? If I'm using epoxy, I'm doing either inlay or filling cracks or, repair, glue, whatever. And I use Alumilite, the urethane resin, for just about everything else, right? And here's some projects that I've done before. Had some people ordered these off of my Instagram site, and it's just some crochet hooks and a couple seam rippers. Here's some handles that are hybrid handles on some. Those are bottle openers. And go back. There we go. Bottle openers, and those openers are made by Stainless Bottle Stoppers. This is a box that I made just out of a stick that I found in my yard. I cut it up into pieces. And I threw it into a mold and filled it up with resin. And I turned a little zebra wood lid for it. This is the same concept, but this is just blocks of ebony with some resin. Here's a bottle stopper and just a different variant of a bottle stopper in purple. This is kind of like a scrap wood bowl. It's just bits and pieces of stabilized wood I had laying around that I didn't want to throw away. I threw it all into a big mold, filled it up with resin, and made this bowl. All right, so Joe, this was the void that I had to fill. So, if you have something like that, I mean, I would say everyone to use that deep pour. If you have something that's not like this, then you'll probably find using just about anything. You got to kind of check to see how deep or how thick a pour you can do, and just make sure that your voids don't exceed that, right? These are made out of Alumilite. This is pine cones, both of them. Okay, also made out of Alumilite. This is dogwood sticks from, the branch I had to take off of one of my trees. And this is stabilized maple cubes in just some black mica colored Alumilite, right? Now, this one's a little bit different, right? This one is actually the penetrating epoxy, was painted on this burl, and then I used the deep pour as the resin here. Okay, so polished up nice, it looks good. You know, this is a burl on both sides with the yellow resin in the middle. It's just yellow colored aluminite. It's dragon egg for me. And this is kind of like a little bit of a wacky piece that I did. I tried to recreate a lava lamp out of resin and some walnut. So it's supposed to look like a lava lamp. All right. Already talked about most of this stuff, so I'm not going to again. Okay, so here, right? Okay, so the wood for Alumilite must be dry, and I can't say must be dry like enough. I mean, I cook my wood in the toaster oven for hours before it touches Alumilite. You know, I let it cool down, you know, to like, you know, room temperature or close to it before I'll pour anything over it. But it has to be dry. If it's not dry, you're going to get surface bubbles, right? It's just not good. And then your casting will be ruined, right? It has to be as close to 0% moisture as you can get it, right? The Alumilite needs to be measured by weight. So a digital scale, mine goes down to 3 decimal places. It's ounces and 3 decimal places. It's really important. And obviously that ratio becomes critical the smaller amount of resin you're using, okay? So a lot of resin, maybe not so critical, a little bit of resin, very critical. And you really have to make sure that you're diligent about scraping the sides and the bottom of the cup to mix the resin. All right, so that's really going to bring us here to the resin sphere, okay? And now I am going to, instead of doing like an actual turning demo, because I don't want to wear all the stuff and everything and it takes too long, I have edited video. So anybody have any questions before we do the video stuff? Video is going to be about 20-25 minutes total.
There's a question about how do you glue the wood block to the bottom of the Star Wars cube?
Okay, so what I do with that is I actually have some Turner's tape that I got from Craft Supply. Okay, and that's what I use. I cut off little bits of the Turner's tape, I put it on the bottom of the burl, and I push that down into the mold, and it stays.
So that's what, 2-sided tape? Is that what you're saying?
It is 2-sided tape, but it's actually called Turner's tape because that glue is like, you know, it's a lot, you know, more
stronger than most,
substantial than like something like carpet tape would be, right?
Right. Okay, I think we're good.
Anything else? All right. Let's get rid of that. And let's get rid of that. And look, so you're not seeing what I'm doing, right? And let's make sure that I can see what I'm doing. And this is demo vids. All right. All right, just bear with me a second. All right. Okay, this video is really only about 1.5 minutes long, and this goes right along to, you know, I think something, Scott, you asked me about cutting up some wood and just throwing it into something and what resin would I use. So you'll see I used the Total Boat High Performance here, right? Now, I don't know if there's any audio in this other than just some shop noises, but we'll see. Or maybe none. All right, so here you can just see I cut up a bunch of cubes, right? All right, the volume's all the way up. I cut up a bunch of cubes. I put them in a cup. You know, I taped the cubes down so they wouldn't float away. They're not stabilized or anything. And now here I'm just mixing up the resin, put it in 2 separate cups, gave me 2 separate colors, poured it all in. You know, I'm going to put that in my pressure pot, seal it up, you know, hook up the hose, pressure. The next day, going to come out. I'm going to make it flat, you know, somewhat on the top. That just happened to fit into my jaws on my chuck. And I made a tenon, turned it around, and then the rest of it's basic, you know, box making, right? So we're going to cut the lid away. I'm going to turn the lid, sand it all up. Now we're going to hollow out the base. You know, and it looks like I didn't measure anything, but obviously I test fit everything and made sure it fit. So, you know, just turning the tenon off of the box top, polishing it up, and we should be done shortly. Okay, so there's an idea, right? There's a really quick idea. It's a little box made out of resin and some pen blanks, right? And you can see that I used that Total Boat High Performance for that.
And
Alright,
how did you polish it?
That was just polished with the Triple E. I guess I didn't have that in the video. Hang on one sec. I know I walked out of the camera shot, but I'm just reaching into a cabinet here. It was polished with this.
Okay.
Okay, and you'll see I use this a lot, right? Now, I might have put that on that field buffing system. I made that so long ago, I don't remember. But this is what you saw me use in the video, although I didn't put the product in the video. So, all right.
Basically,
so the
that's
next thing,
it's sanded. It's sanded and then polished with the triple.
that piece was sanded to 600 and then polished with this.
Okay, great.
It may or may not have been buffed, but I would think probably not. Okay. So the next video that I have here is a video of me creating one of the Star Wars blanks. And we're going to start out with that Illuminate A, and you're going to see me, I'm going to go and pour it in the cup. And there's my scale, and you see we're going to put in about 15 ounces of resin. And I sped this up a little bit. I'm not that good that I could pour that quickly and it come up that close, right? But 15 ounces of resin, I'm going to zero that scale out again and then pour in 15 ounces of the other component, the B side, right? You're just pouring the resin in, right? And once again, I sped this video up on this, you know, because it takes, you really got to be precise. And you're going to see, I mean, the other one was like, you know, what, a couple thousandths, you know, shy. And this one's going to be, I think, a couple thousandths over. But, you know, when we're talking thousands of an ounce, I'm not going to worry about that, you know. But still, both of them pretty close to 15, right? So that's pretty close to 15, right? And then mixing. So the next step, we're going to take that off of there. Come on, video. There we go. We're going to mix it up, right? Just mix it up. And you're going to see when I'm mixing this here, I'm going to wind up scraping the sides. You know, I'll twist the cup, scrape the sides, twist the cup, scrape the sides. And when you mix these two pieces together, or the part A and the part B, you can the two chemicals have different viscosities, and you'll see that it'll create like little wispy trails as the two chemicals are mixing up. And you want to make sure that all those little wispy trails are gone, right? And that's why you're scraping the sides and all that, right? So I want to add a little bit of color to this. I just put some red dye in this one. This is, you know, this was ordered by somebody and they wanted it red. And, you know, I'm just showing you how little bit of this dye goes a long way, right? That's on a toothpick, right? So I'm just going to dab that into the resin, you know, and I'm showing you right there just a little bit, dab it into the resin, and that's all I'm using. If I put a full drop in there, the thing would have been, you know, totally opaque and you wouldn't be able to see through it. And the whole idea here is just to make it look like it's a transparent red. So, and I learned that by trial and error. And yes, I did screw up a couple and make them too dark. So it's just mixing it in. And then, you know, I only have 12 minutes total to get all this done. Obviously the video sped up a bit here. And here's the mold. And you can see I got my piece of burl in there and I got the little ship on there, and that ship's sitting on a little piece of fiber optic cable. And that's what I use, something I got off of Amazon. It's a very thin, you know, plastic material. I think it's like 0.75 millimeters thick. So now when you turn this into a sphere, it magnifies that toy inside there. So when it's done, and you'll see like all of them, there's just, the toy looks really, really big in comparison to how big it really is. So it's really nice. I mean, the reason I use those X-Wing miniature pieces is because of the detail that they have. They just look great. So you can see I put the piece here into the pressure pot, and, you know, I'm old, so bent down, screwing on all the nuts. Now, obviously, the wing nuts, I sped this up. I mean, I can't work this fast. And then I have to remember to close those valves at the end, which you'll see that I forgot. Like, I'll be ready to put the air in and be like, oh yeah, I got to close those valves. There we go. close the valve, Scott. All right, hook up the air. And I have to apologize. For me to get this shot, I literally had to lay on the floor, so the camera's going to be a little bit shaky. I don't have a tripod that goes down that low. So I'm just showing you here that I put in about 60 pounds of pressure. And the next day, I'm going to unscrew all those wing nuts, let the air out, unscrew the wing nuts. And you're going to see that piece is going to come out of there crystal clear. Just amazing every time. I'm totally blown away how well this stuff works. And it's every time, you know. So there's the piece. And now we're going to take it out of the molds. And I told you that I don't use mold release with those HDPE molds. And here you're going to see why I like those P-Town subby molds better than the lizard blank ones. And you see this just for workflow reasons. They just, I mean, it's so much easier to get those screws out than it is to be dealing with those wing nuts. So, and here's how hard it is to take this out, even with no mold release, right? Now I wrestled with this just a little bit. And now I just knock those sides off with a mallet, but you know, not a big, you know, heavy duty thing here, and no mold release at all. So that HDPE is really the good thing for molds there, right? So there's the block. Now the only thing that I don't have on any video is I take that block and I disc sand the bottom of it to rough it up a little bit, and then I glue a piece of maple onto it as a waste block. But I kind of talk about that in the next video. And I'm going to shut up because the next video, for the most part, I believe is narrated. So, wow, it would be, but I have no sound. Oh, I know why I have no sound. Let's do this. Into a sphere. And we'll be doing that. All right, well, that's not going to work. This is heavy. All right, so I guess I am going to narrate this, right? So I thought this would have actually had the sound with it, but it's not working.
Okay, here's our cube.
So,
And you can see
all right, so what I'm here is I'm basically just showing that I blew this block on.
I've let that sit overnight.
We have, Scott, we have sound. We can hear it.
I've marked this
Oh, okay, well then I don't. Okay,
I'll
cool.
block
Then I'll
so I
shut
can
up.
count it all
If you have
out.
any questions, just stop and I'll stop the video and you can ask.
Scribed on the top.
You might put your mic near the
The
laptop.
same thing. Okay, so we've now determined the center point, so we can get the thing mounted up on the lathe and get
Perfect.
turning.
Scott, do you hear the video?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so I can't hear it.
So this needs to be.
Hey, Scott, I got a question. Earlier before you said you used the Turner's tape to attach that wooden block to that cube. And then on the video, you said you glued it on. So a little bit confused here.
All right, so I'll stop that. So what I use the Turner's tape for is to glue the burl into the mold
Oh, okay.
so it doesn't float in the resin.
Okay. I'm talking about that wooden block. That's what I was
No, that
getting at
wooden
before.
block is glued on with 5-minute epoxy.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
All right.
I've got a
Clear
big
that
thing.
all up?
I've got a big dragon egg. So I've got to turn, and I just wondered how to get that wood on there.
Oh no, yeah, I use 5-minute epoxy. Some people told me it's like, oh, you know, you can use hot glue. And I'm like, you know what? I've had hot glue fail on me. 5-minute epoxy has never failed ever for me on something like this. So I use the 5-minute epoxy.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for clearing that up.
Yep.
Hey, Scott, on the video, the sound was low, then it got better, and now it's low again. So not
Yeah,
quite.
there's nothing I can really do about that because I recorded that on my phone, and that was before I actually had like a dedicated mic for my shop.
Okay. Why don't you just talk us through it and we'll just watch the video.
Okay, so what I did was I just turned the sphere into a cylinder, right? And I used a spindle roughing gouge. And what I'm talking about right now is I'm going to actually take that waste block and I'm going to take that waste block and I'm going to, you know, turn a tenon on it so I can put it in the chuck. And so you can see, like, put a dovetail on there, right? And I'm now just, I'm talking about, you know, I'm going to pull this thing off of the lathe, you know, take out the, that center point thing, and we're going to put the, it in the chuck. All right.
I
right, so
thought
what
you
it
were gonna
basically
lip
said there-
sync to it.
Yeah, sorry. So what it basically said there was, is now I got it in the chuck, I'm going to true it up. And then what we're going to have to do after it gets trued up is I'm actually going to have to draw, and you know, if I'm going to narrate it, I'm going to turn the volume down on this completely.
Right.
Because I mean, there's really pointless for, just in case the volume comes back, right? So I got this trued up, and what I'm going to do is I have to mark the center point on here, and I have, you know, the little, you know, center ruler, and I got to mark the center point, and that's really so I can set up the sphere jig. Okay, so I'm just marking the point here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the lathe so I can mark that all the way around. And there we got a line on the piece, right? So we have it all nice, you know, cylinder line all the way around. And then the next step from here is I'm going to have to turn those corners away, right? Because we're going to want to take some of those corners down. You know, we want to get it spherical. So now I actually could just use the sphere jig and do that whole thing. And the point I'm making in the video is that that cutter on the sphere jig, you know, it's one of those cupped carbide cutters, and they're very expensive. It's a Hunter cutter, right? So, and I mean, I can buy replacement cutters from Hunter, but you know, they're like 25 bucks a pop. Or I can use my spindle gouge and take a lot of that material away so I can save that cutter for when I need it. And that's really kind of the point I'm making here. And now I'm just showing you, I'm just using standard turning tools. You know, I'm using traditional, you know, a spindle gouge to take that corner down. And but I'm going to throw a little bit of a curve here. I'm going to give you an alternative, because I know there's some people that like to use the carbide tools. And this is a, you know, a Easy Wood Tools tool with a one of their negative rake cutters on it. So, and I'm just going to show you that it doesn't really matter what you use. They both work equally as well. If you have Easy Wood Tools, good. If you have traditional tools, good. And as a matter of fact, you know, they make this, Easy Wood Tools makes a big deal out of this negative rake cutter. And I'm not going to, you know, I don't want to downplay it. The thing's great, but I could have done exactly the same thing with just my regular negative rake scraper, right? It would have cut away that resin just as well. So if you have Easy Wood Tools, use them. If you don't feel like you have to buy them. And here I'm just turning the back side of that sphere now. I'm just trying to remove material because I know it's going to have to, you know, it's going to be turned away anyway, right? So now that I have that, like, you know, somewhat, you know, with the corners turned away, I could continue to make that, you know, closer to a sphere. But I mean, I have a sphere jig and it's extremely efficient. So, you know, instead of wasting my time turning that down, I'm going to use this sphere jig, and this is made by Vermec. It's extremely heavy, heavy duty piece of equipment. The thing's made out of solid steel. And here I have it on the lathe, and you're going to see there's that little center post. I'm going to raise that up, and it's held in place with a little rubber O-ring. And I'm going to line that up so that center post is in line with the line we drew. And that defines where the center of that sphere is going to be, right? And you can see, like, that's dead center of that arm that's going to slide around. And you can see there from that picture that, you know, that point is lined right up with that post. So now I've lowered that post out of the way. And now I'm going to have to move that cutter arm, and I'm going to have to put that close enough to the sphere to actually get it to work, right? I had it adjusted out further for a different project I was working on. So now I'm going to show you how to adjust this. And there's like a little set screw here. So what we're going to do is we're going to loosen that set screw. And I keep saying we all the time. It's just like no one's in the shop but me, right? So it's like, I don't know who we is, but apparently we do a lot of stuff. So yeah, so I loosen the set screw, and then I'm going to need a wrench. And then there's a bolt at the bottom, and I'm going to take a wrench and loosen that bolt. And now that that's loose, I'll be able to slide that cutter in and out on that arm. And I'm going to put that to about where I need it to be. And then I'm going to tighten the bolt back up. And after I get that bolt tightened up, I'm going to, you see there's a black knob on that cutter itself. And I'm going to loosen that up just so I can make sure I have enough clearance. And I kind of push that cutter almost right up against the sphere, so I know I can cut in as deep as I need to, but I also want to make sure I can back it out enough to get clearance off that piece. And then once I have everything set right, I'm going to tighten up that set screw and lock that in place. Okay. And so the next thing to do here is I'm just really kind of pointing out that the initial setup for this piece, I didn't talk about it prior to this, and I thought I should touch on it. I actually shot this whole thing to put it on the YouTube and explain how to use this jig. But here, what I'm basically saying is it's this one-time setup for your lathe. So now that we have everything all set up, we're going to get to turning the sphere, and it goes pretty quick. And I've sped the video up because I don't want to bore everybody to death, you know. But here you can see how this sphere jig works, right? And it's what I'm doing here is I'm actually taking a slight pause when I get towards the middle, and I'm turning that little black knob about a quarter turn, right? And that takes off just enough material where, you know, it cuts off nice and clean, but it doesn't get chippy. I'm not taking off too much. I don't get any vibration, and I'm actually explaining that right now. But you can see I'm cutting on both sides of that sphere, but I'm staying away, at least for now, staying away from that waste block, you know, and I'll address that a little bit different as we get closer to this being done. And I said, what's the we? All right, so this is more like real time. All right, this is pretty much, I think this pass and the next one might be 100% real time, you know, where everything else had been sped up. So you can see about how fast this is going, and it does go pretty quick. Okay, so there's that quarter turn, and then here we go back to sped up video, different angle, just so you get a different perspective. And really, this does not take long at all, you know. And the nice thing about this sphere jig is like not only is it, you know, efficient, but I'm not going to make a mistake. The sphere is going to be as big as it possibly can be, and I'm selling these pieces, so you know, I don't want to waste the resin. I don't want to make a mistake. I mean, I got probably about like $75 to $100 of materials in that blank. I mean, it's a 5-inch sphere. So I definitely don't want to make a, you know, something for the trash bin. Here you go. So I still have the sphere jig in place, set up, and you're going to see I'm going to move my tool rest into a position here, and I'm going to take some of this waste block away. And then I'm going to use the sphere jig to take the burl away and just continue that arch or curve of that sphere in as far as I possibly can go. But I can't do it all at once. I'm going to do a little bit out of it, a little bit of it. Phew, I'm not even saying that right. I'm going to do a little bit at a time. There we go. So here you can see I got the tool rest in place, and you can see I'm supporting, you know, the tailstock end now with a cup center that I made, and it's just a piece that threads onto the end of my live center, and I have an O-ring on there so it doesn't damage the plastic. Yeah, not that it would, I mean, but it's like just a little extra cushion. And here you can see I'm turning away some of the maple just to give me some room, and then I use the sphere jig to turn away at that burl. You know, I mean, that Malley burl, if you've ever turned it, this stuff's like concrete. So that little carbide cutter really kind of blows through that stuff really quick, and it cuts it relatively clean as well. So now you can see I did a little bit there, and what I'm talking about right now is that you really don't want to do this all at once. It's just kind of like a progression, and you're going to see I'm going to do that same thing I just did, maybe like 2 or 3 more times, and I'm going to get that until I have like a little nub down at the end that's maybe about like a 1/2 inch-ish, you know, in diameter, and then we're going to cut that off the lathe with a handsaw. So here we are back, you know, taking away some of that glue block, and then taking away some of the burl with the sphere jig, you know, making sure that the line stays up. And here's just a different angle. Sorry it's not in focus, but you'll get the idea, right? And you can see I'm just whittling that away, and then just as soon as it starts touching the rest of the sphere, I know I'm done, okay? And then here we are, it got down small enough, and that was as small as I wanted to go, cut it off with a handsaw. So I got the sphere jig off the lathe now, and I have that sphere mounted between 2 cup centers, and they're both just homemade. Now I know they make cup centers that you can buy, and if you want to buy them, great. My cup centers, the one I already showed you from the other view, and the one that's in the chuck itself now, they're just scrap pieces of cherry I had laying around. And I've been using them now for the better part of like, what, 2 or 3 years, just making these spheres, and no reason for me to make anything new. It's holding up really well. So what I need to do is I need to turn that little nub away. Okay, and here's just a different angle. You saw me walk out of the frame. That's so I could move the camera, right? And that nub, I'm just going to make it so it just clears the tool rest. All right. So it's just clearing the tool rest here. And I got my gouge all sharpened up. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the light so you can see what I see when I'm turning. And I know we've probably all seen this before, right? But you'll see when I turn this on, that nub is going to create like a shadow, right? And the idea here is to turn that shadow away, right? And if you turn the shadow away, then we should have a totally round sphere when we're done. You also can see where the sphere is supposed to be, which is a good visual for when you're turning, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn most of that away. So here we go. We're turning most of it away. And I'm going to stop when it looks good to me, but you're going to see I'm going to stop the lathe, and there's going to be just a little bit left. Sorry, I got a drink of water. All right. So there's just a little bit left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my spindle gouge, and I'm going to use those wings and shear scrape that little nub that's still left on there. And I'm just going to scrape that down as best as I can. All right. So here we go. Just using the wing of there, just shear scraping both sides. And you can see I got like 99% of that nub is completely gone. Now there's just a little bit of a ridge there. And it looks worse in the video than it actually even is. And you're going to see, like, you know, my solution to fix this is not turning at this point because I'm cutting into the resin, but I've just grabbed a piece of 120 sandpaper. I mean, I use the Abranet, and I left this in real time on purpose so you could see how quickly this goes. Now, I think the video time here is like maybe like a minute and a half of me sanding. So a minute and a half sanding to get that thing perfectly spherical, to get that nub away, is like no time at all. You know, I know real-time sanding isn't very fun to watch, but I think the point here was it doesn't take very long. You know, I still see some remnants of where that sphere jig was on the wood, so I'm just going to take care of that. And when we're done, we're going to have something that's basically 100% spherical, or as close to being perfectly spherical as I can get it, you know, with my tools. All right, so I'm just working on a little bit here where I'm sure you can see that little bit of a line there. And now, for the most part, it's almost all gone. Just a little bit of touch up. Buff that all up. All right, now that didn't take long. And if I do remember correctly, I think it was like 1 minute and 50 seconds of sanding, you know, to sand that nub away. So I wish all sanding only took 1 minute and 50 seconds, you know. So there we go. All nice and smooth. So the next step after this is to basically sand the entire piece. Now this takes a really long time. And what I'm talking about in the video is we're going to sand from 120 up through 800. Okay. So, I mean, that's what I do. I generally at this point, I mean, I used to sand up to 600. I don't really know if it makes a difference to go up to 800 because the ones I do up to 600 polish up really nice. But I generally now go up to 800, and I'm talking about that I'm using the Abranet, and, you know, the sanding screen is really nice because it's like, you know, all the particles, they go right through the screen. It doesn't clog up the paper, blah, blah, blah. You know the deal. But what I have to do is I have to sand while it's on the lathe. And then because it's a sphere, I'm going to have to then rotate it 90 degrees onto the second axis to sand the same grit again. Okay. So, and then we're going to rotate it 90 degrees to put it on that third axis and then sand the entire piece again. So in effect, what I'm basically doing is for every grit, I'm sanding that piece 3 times. So I cover every axis of that sphere. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody, but it's kind of like, you know, basics on sanding a sphere. And this is as fast as I could speed up the sanding portion that my editing software would let me, because obviously sanding not very exciting, you know. But here you can see I'm rotating the piece, sanding, rotating the piece, sanding. You might get glimpses of that I've changed the paper, you know, to a different grit, you know, but you can see the scratches are getting progressively finer and finer and finer up until we hit 800, and I think that's what I'm on right now. And then we sand it up to 800 and we're done, right? So the next step after sanding is I'm going to use that Tripoli Ultra Shine, and all it is the polishing wax. I used to buy it because I used to make pens, and it was marketed to people who did pens. And I just found that it works really well on this plastic. It works great on Alumilate. It works great on almost every other type of epoxy that I've used. And so you can see I'm using it here, right? So it'll definitely take all that haze off there from the scratches from the 800 grit, right? And the thing polished up pretty nice. And, you know, a lot of people say like, hey, that looks great. But it doesn't. And the only reason I know it doesn't look great is because I know what it can look like after we buff it, right? So, you know, I only did 2 axes with the, or axes. I only did 2 axes with the polishing compound because I'm really not taking any material away, right? I just wanted to make sure I buffed the whole thing. And then I got the pieces that were hidden by the cup centers. And now you can see I'm going to actually take this to my buffing wheel, which really is just, I mean, just put the Beal buffing system wheels on my lathe. It's a 3-wheel system, if you're not familiar. It's a Tripoli wheel, a white diamond wheel, and a wax wheel. We're not going to use the wax wheel for this process. Although, I mean, sometimes I'll put the wax just on the wood, you know, but then I got to make sure it doesn't get on the plastic because it will cloud up the plastic a little bit. I mean, you can just wipe it right off and that's fine, but I try not to put any wax on the plastic, right? So here we are. I loaded up the wheel with the compound and I'm just going to town on it. Now I actually have a pattern. It's like I find part of the ship and that was my starting point. And I do that and, you know, go through different, you know, turn, buff, turn, buff, turn, buff until it's done, right? And then here you can see I've already switched to the white diamond. I'm doing the same pattern. You know, I got to make sure I cover every piece, you know, every bit. And then here's your final product, right? It's quite a difference between that and when it came out of that off with the Tripoli polishing wax. I mean, that thing's like clear as glass, you know, it's absolutely polishes beautiful. So there's the resin sphere. That's how I make them. There's really not like a whole lot to it. You know, it's a lot of steps, but they're not hard. You just need to have the right equipment. If anybody's interested in making one of these, I'll be more than happy to like walk you through it, help you with it. You know, if you get my contact info or you contact me through Instagram, I'll be more than I've probably, you know, given hundreds of people information on how to improve their sphere turning or resin polishing or whatever, as long as they're using similar materials that I'm using, right? So, and here I am just basically buffing off any of the wax compound, you know, with just the t-shirt, and there you go. I mean, that Alumilate clear slow is just amazing stuff. I mean, that really kind of speaks for itself. That's just absolutely 100% nuts. Does anybody have any questions at all?
Scott, that was great.
All right, I have one more thing here, if you want to see it.
Go ahead.
And really, it's very short, but it's just variations of a theme, okay? So you should be able to see that, right? Yep, you can see that.
Yep.
So the same thing, but with blue tinted resin. It's sitting in my windowsill in my house. I mean, the thing looks awesome. All these pieces I've sold, every one except for 3. 1 I still have myself, 2 I gave to my daughter. All the rest of them are sold. So they're extremely popular. So that's all I can say. In the background, you can see in the background, that's just a different ship from Star Wars. It's a B-wing fighter as opposed to an X-wing fighter. And that's the next slide. That was actually a special order. Someone ordered that. So, you know, I tried to meet that request and, you know, they paid a little bit extra for a custom piece, which is always good for me. So here's how that ship is supposed to fly in the Star Wars world. Man, getting tongue-tied. So, and these all sit on a little stand that I make. It's just basically like a 3-corner stand. It's the same concept as making a 3-corner bowl. There's just a little depression in the top, so the sphere sits in it. That's all. Nothing super special.
And you're
here's
using
another blue tinted one.
You're using a piece of fiber optic to hold the vessel up.
Yeah, the little post that I use. What I'm doing is I take the ship, right, and I showed you that, right? I mean, commercial. Here we go. Commercially available product. I'm showing it, and I can see it, but you can't, right? So here we go. It's just a toy from a game. right? You buy these pieces, these are about like $15 a pop. There's a little post on the bottom of them. I snap that off with a pair of pliers, and then I take a circuit board drill, okay? Now, it's a 0.75 millimeter drill bit that is made for drilling holes in a circuit board, right? I found them on Amazon. They're made out of solid carbide. They break extremely easily. And I drill a little hole in the bottom of the toy, and then I CA glue the 0.75 millimeter fiber optic material into that. And then I drill a little teeny hole, same drill bit, into the burl, and that's how everything goes together.
Okay, cool.
All make sense? All right,
Could,
cool deal.
could
So-
that, if that sphere was multiple pores, would that work, or you would see the seam?
Okay, so multiple pores. I didn't address that, but I'm glad you asked because I probably should have, right? The few times that I've tried to do multiple pores, I can't get it so you don't see the layer,
Okay,
okay? It's visible to some extent, sometimes worse than others, even with the same resin, right? I mean, I'm using clear slow, right? Sometimes it's very visible, sometimes it's not very visible. But that's a lot of rolling the dice, right? For, I mean, $100 blank, right?
yeah,
So if you do that and it comes up and you see that, and you know, that's been referred to by, once again, my friend Zach Higgins, who did a lot of testing with multiple pores and trying to suspend objects. And as a result of all his experimentation, he basically, it's just like, it's not good, you know? Multiple pores not good. Now, if you have multiple colors, it's different, right? So
That's
like
what
if
I
you
was
wanted to have
wondering.
like a base color, you know what I mean, and have it sitting on top of that and put clear over top of it, well, you're not going to care that there's going to be a line because, you know, and he did something like that with, like, he did a train, like a little N gauge rail. That's a small one, right? The N gauge, right? Well, whatever that small train is, right? You know, like the little
yeah,
model trains. He did one of those, and he did it. He cast it in a piece that it was a big block, and then he turned that so it looked like a train in a bottle. But the first layer he poured was supposed to be like the railroad track, you know. So he did that black, and then he had some pieces that he put in there for the track, right? So
Okay.
you don't see the line, even though it's still there, right? Because it's two different colors. One's clear and one's black. So it's like you don't see that witness line, you know. But anytime I've tried multiple pours, I always see the line. You know, like I said, sometimes worse than others. The other suggestion that people have given me, why don't you make the post out of the same resin instead of using something else, because then it should disappear. Well, it should, but it doesn't. So I can't turn the Alumilite thin enough, as thin as that fiber optic stuff is, right? So now it's thicker and I can still see it,
okay,
you know? So is it as visible? I guess it depends. I mean, to me, it's thicker, but it kind of blends in better, right? Or the other one is a little bit more visible, but it's thinner. So it's like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Nobody complains about the way they're made so far. And to be honest, I mean, I think, I don't know if we talked about this or not, I just don't remember, but it's just like now when I sell these pieces, I have a set price that I post them on my Etsy site, right? And the 5-inch sphere is $300, right? And I can't even get them listed on Etsy. And you know, I'm not trying to brag or anything, but it's like, when I make one of those resin spheres, I usually get several offers of people to buy them before I even can list it on Etsy. And they're generally offering me more than they know that it's going to be sold for. So, you know, I have no problem selling them the way that I make them. Experimenting with that much material. I know so many other people, people making similar things, you know, either cubes, spheres, eggs, whatever their variant of it is. And a lot of people doing the same type of thing, either with Legos or whatever. If the thing has to be suspended, it's on a post. You know, some people still make the posts out of Alumilite. I can see the post in every one of those pieces, you know.
okay.
I can see the post in every one of my pieces.
So somebody asked about getting the fiber optic piece. I think you said Amazon.
Well, I got it off Amazon. I mean, to be honest, you could use either the stuff that I use, which I wish I could give you like an Amazon like product number, but I bought the stuff probably like, you know, so many years ago. I couldn't even find it in my on my order list. But it basically, it looks like fishing line, right?
Okay.
And to be honest, if I would have thought about it, and I probably should have, because I used to go fishing all the time, I would try that and try it on a small scale if you're not sure, right? I mean, take a little piece of fishing line and put it in something like, you know, maybe the size of like a pen blank, and see if it has any weird chemical reaction. And if it doesn't, it should work just as well as what I'm using, you know? And I have to say that too, because it's like the post that comes with the toy, and I'm not going to break open the pack to show you, it comes with a very thick post. It is a game piece, you know, and there's something on that post that reacts funny with the resin and turns it completely white, right? Now, I don't know why this, I don't care why that is. I break all that off anyway, and I don't use the post that comes with it. I use the, I did in the beginning, you know, the first couple I made have a white post on them, and that's why. But now I use that fiber optic material. I'll give you some if you want some, you know. I mean, not that I can give it to everybody. I don't know how many people are here, but you know, I've sent that to people, you know. I mean, I can give you like 3 foot of it. It'll probably last you the rest of your life, you know. And I
Okay.
have a spool of it that's going to last me like 10 lifetimes.
Got it.
So
There's a question from Dave Potts. Dave, why don't you just ask the question? Because I'm not sure I understand.
You're using a American Beauty lathe, Scott?
yes, sir.
Okay, and which size Vermec jig are you using? The largest
The
one?
biggest
24?
one they make.
Biggest? Okay,
It's the biggest one. I think if I remember correctly, they make 3, right? 3 sizes.
correct, yes. Okay.
Yeah, the biggest one.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I got a quick question. I see on some of them you have the like the cloudy swirls in. Is that something you inject in, or is that something you just mix in? And
Okay,
how much
so
do you have
it's almost like I paid you to ask that question because I just put that slide up, right? Okay, so those swirls, all they are is that you know when I showed you I was putting that dye in to mix it up with the and I only put a little bit in on the toothpick. That's all that is. I just don't mix it. Okay, it's the same thing. It's a little bit of dye on a toothpick. You know, I'm letting you look at that picture. Okay, it's a little bit of dye on a toothpick. I dunk it into the resin, and I might do that in 2 or 3 different places. And then I take another dry piece of stick, and when I say piece of stick, I'm using tongue depressors, and I snap them in half. Okay, and that's generally what I do. And I'll just take that and I'll just move it through that dye to give me some swirls. Let's just call them that, right? So now the thing is you don't want to mix it up too much or it'll start to mix in, right? And the other thing is it's not going to stay there because when that resin cures in the pressure pot, because of the heat, there's convection currents, right? And that stuff's going to move all over the place. It's never going to look like what it looked. It's never going to look the same when you take it out as it did when you put it in, right? So I just move the stuff around just a little bit and then just let the convection currents do their thing. And then, you know, I get pieces that, you know, that come up looking like this. And that's not me. I wish I was that good enough that I could move the stuff around and it stay there. It's just, that's the resin doing its thing. This piece here was a custom order from somebody who wanted this. This is the Slave One or Boba Fett's ship in something, and it is so big I couldn't put it in a sphere. Right? It's just a big. In this game, all the pieces in the game are supposed to be relatively to scale, if there is such a thing for make believe, right? But it's all supposed to be to scale. So there's certain toys that won't fit, right? Just because of the sheer size of them. And I get a lot of requests for this guy, right? It's like, when are you going to do one with the Millennial Falcon? Well, here's why I can't do one. This is the biggest mold I have, right? This is not the mold, obviously. This is the blank. And here's the Millennial Falcon. This is why I haven't done one. It won't fit, okay? So I like the detail in these. I mean, I've seen ones before that are smaller and the detail is not as good. But when you look at the pieces that come with this X-Wing Miniatures game, when you buy them, just look at the detail of those pieces. You know, I mean, they're painted really nice. All the little detail is there, and that sphere magnifies whatever's inside there. You know, so if it's small and it doesn't look that great, and it gets magnified, then it's going to be big and not look that great, right? So, I mean, that's why I use these. And I think, you know, I mean, I think my contribution to this whole thing, if everybody wants to say they have something, like I don't know anybody that was using these X-Wing miniatures. I know people who used other toys before, and I know some people use micro machines and everything, and wire and whatever, and different variations of whatever. And this looks the best to me, and apparently to everybody else as well. I don't know. I think this is a total win. So, I mean, if someone can refine this process, if they would want to share that information with me, I'd appreciate it. You know, I mean, that would be a total win for me, right? I'm always up to, I'm refining my process, but at least to this point, that's really the best I can do, right? And I think that might be, this is the last piece that I turned. That was just maybe like last week. And that was a group project we did on Instagram. And that's, you know, I don't know if you're into Star Wars lore at all, but that's the TIE Advanced Fighter. That was the Darth Vader ship in, you know, the movies that he was in, right? What was that? The first 3 or 4, 5, and 6, depending on how you look at it, right? So, but that was the ship that he piloted, and that was the group project on Instagram. They got the, you know, my audience in Instagram. I got a bit of a following there. I got about 85,000 people following my Instagram account. They picked the ship, they picked the colors, they picked whether or not the resin was a solid color or clear, whether or not it was swirls or not, and the color of the swirls, and that's what they built. And then one of the people bought it. So, you know, I was pretty happy about that. And, you know, I was talking to Scott earlier, I'm actually now donating 2/3 of all the money I make off of these spheres now. And I think just about anything else in my shop, I'm donating it to MS. So I ride the MS Bikeathon. This is my shirt from the MS Bikeathon last year, which was virtual. But I rode 100 miles on my bike and my trainer in my den, you know, and did some auctions with some other woodworkers, put together, I guess, a group of like maybe like 10 of us. Names that you might know. Derek Weidman, do you know Derek or know of Derek? Derek actually was great. John Jordan helped out. Zach, my friend Zach, the resin guy, he helped out. A couple of other people. I mean, there's a guy, Derry Wood Turning on Instagram. He made a piece that was sold. A couple other people, and my good friend Mike Soko Joko, Mike Early. I don't think I could have put that whole thing together without him, but we raised pretty close to $9,000 for MS last year, for, you know, just putting something together like last minute. So that was kind of cool. So I'm donating all my, basically it's all my profits. I'm keeping what I can do to keep my shop running, buying materials. Obviously the stuff's expensive. I got to buy the burls. I got to buy the resins and, you know, sanding stuff and everything. But, you know, all the profits now go into MS. So.
Scott, we really enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
So
great
you
presentation.
can give me the real critique later, Scott, on my first demo over Zoom.
You covered everything I hoped you would. So
well, that's awesome. That's very good to hear. So if anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
We can distribute any of the materials you'd like to send. I tried to take screenshots of the participants. Hopefully I'll get everybody. But yeah, that was great.
Well, who was the person who said they were, was that David? Was that you? You said you're doing a little bit of resin work?
What was the question again?
Did you say earlier on that you were doing a little bit of resin work and
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Did you learn anything?
Yes, I did. Yeah. Yep.
Then it's a win for me. That's the way I'm looking at it.
Yep. Always a win. Always a win.
Right? Any knowledge is good knowledge, right? So, all right, cool deal. All righty.
Scott, I'm going to stop the recording unless you have anything further to add.
Well, like I said, if anybody has any questions at all, I'll be more than happy to ask them or answer them. If you're on Instagram and you want to zip me a message, you know, I answer every message I get on Instagram. I try to answer every comment on every one of my posts on Instagram. So, I mean, sometimes they get comments on posts that are so long ago that I might not ever see that comment. But like, I mean, for the most part, I mean, I generally get, you know, I don't even want to guess. Probably about like, 15, 20, 30 messages a week, in a DM, the direct messaging, and usually hundreds of comments a day. So it's just, I try to address them all if I can, So anything at all, if you have a question, I mean, even if it's, reach out to me, email wise, my email's listed on my Instagram, and that's my woodworking email. It's not my personal email. But if you send me a message to that email on my Instagram, if you're an Instagram person, I'll answer it, So I guess
Well,
that's it for me, unless you got something else.
Thank you very much.